Okay, we're going to start up with the back half for 2/3 of the A-201. We will get through all the remaining provisions today. We ended with Article 5. We were talking about subcontractors. Effectively, the concept of the relationships with the subcontractors is they owe the same duties as a general large picture. They are going to owe the same duties to the contractor as the contractor owes to the owner. The concept is what they use is what's called flow-down provisions. And so important key provisions in this document will be flowed down and will be in the contract between the contractor and the subcontractor. One of the reasons why I mentioned this concept of flow-down and incorporation is that's one of the things that is really good about the AIA suite of documents. What often happens, and you guys might find this when you're out there in the industry, you'll have a standalone contract that the owner and the contractor want to enter into. Sometimes contractors take this document, the A-201, and they modify it and they change things and they make it their own. Or they write one from scratch, whole cloth. And the owner enters into that agreement. You want to make sure that the same terms, the same language is being used for the same definitions, the same ideas between the contractor and the subcontractor. If you don't have those flow-down provisions, if the provisions that the contractor owes the owner doesn't go down to the subcontractor, then you may have a problem in a lawsuit where the owner says to the contractor, you're supposed to be doing X. And the contractor says, well, I didn't do that. That was my electrical subcontractor. So he turns to the electrical subcontractor and they say, we weren't going to do X. We were going to do Y. Here's the provision. So this is something that's important. Happens the same with architects. If you guys enter into agreements with your consultants downstream, the electrical engineer, the mechanical engineer, you want to keep the same terms and conditions. So that's why the AIA documents are great because all the definitions are already the same. As we've seen when we went over this last week, Article 4, it was almost a repetition of the exact same things because that's the architect's role in the project as what we all learned in the B-101. So, okay. Moving forward on Article 6, we're going to talk about construction by owner or by separate contractors. So separate contractors here is going to be a defined term. That's, again, it's interesting here they have it in quotes. Sometimes, just as a side in contract drafting, sometimes you'll see it in quotes, separate contractors, but the S and the C are capitalized. Sometimes you just may see a capitalized term. So, just as a drafting methodology. But a separate contractor shall mean contractors retained by the owner under separate agreements. And the owner reserves the rights to perform construction operations related to the project with the owner's own forces. So there are times, some projects, where the owner actually has their own team. You know, they may, so for example, you may have a company that has their own specialized equipment. And that equipment is proprietary. They don't want the general public to see that. So they'll hire an architect to design the building and the connection points and all of the electrical and all the requirements they need to power the factory and the space they need to power the factory. And then the contractor will build that project from the drawings. And then the project is completed as far as what the contractor and the architect are responsible for. And then the owner comes in. And they may either manufacture some of their own equipment or they may have specialty people making the equipment and the owner has their own team to install that. So sometimes it's the owner's own forces and sometimes it's separate contractors that they bring in. And so that happens more often than you can imagine. I mean, sometimes it's as like I'm saying in a factory where it's the whole guts of the building. Or sometimes, as the example I've used from time to time here in class, is a company builds a hotel and they have the architect that's a hotel designer design the hotel and they have the contractor build it, but they want some front-end piece, like a signature restaurant. And they may actually work with either maybe a star, somebody like, like a Michael or Tom Colicchio. He's the guy that, if you've ever seen the show Top Chef, he's very famous for craft steaks, is the name of his brand, and he's got restaurants all over the world. And he has a hand in making designs. And so he'll have interests and ideas. And so sometimes you have specialized One of my clients, actually, that's all they do is specialty food services. And they'll go in and be retained by the owner to specifically design a food court or specifically design a restaurant or something to that effect. So that would be a separate contractor because the owner gets something more than what the straight-up architect will provide. 6.2 just talks about who the terms are. 6.1.2. 6.1.3, the owner shall provide for coordination of the activities of the owner's own forces and each of the separate contractors for the work of the contractor who shall cooperate with them. Now, this is an interesting provision because this places the onus on the owner to coordinate. Now, coordination is a specific term and it has a connotation in the industry of how these things are supposed to work. Coordination is where do the plugs come in? Where do the electrical lines come in? Where do the HVAC system, how does that all work? And when you coordinate drawings, normally the architect hires an electrical engineer, a mechanical engineer, the various engineers, and they get all their subcontractors, subconsultants to provide all the information to the architect on a basic design. And the architect has to make sure, if we look in this room, so here's a duct for the HVAC. And then we have this red line up here. This is the fire protection. And then you have the white pipes that are going here. That's for your electrical. When the drawings came in, there were 3 different trades that did this. And if they all had their lines running right where the duct was, then you couldn't fit them all in the same spot. So what the architect does is they move things over and they coordinate where they are going in the space. And this is the room here, everything's open. What a lot of times you don't see is what's behind the scenes. And sometimes we have a big wide open space. Sometimes there's not that much room. If you remember my discussion last week when we had I was talking about the jail in the 26th in California where they were pumping that epoxy and it started coming out of these pipes. In the back room, that's one of those circuit breaker boxes. And see all the pipes leading into that? Well, what happened was, as I said, there was both plumbing and electrical that were side by side and they weren't capped and they were oozing everywhere. But that was because it was partially a coordination issue. Coordination is not only to make sure they're not in the right space, but as the project goes along, has the work done to cap things off. So here, the onus is on the owner to have its separate contractors. The owner needs to provide for coordination. Now that's interesting because it makes this concept of, does the owner have the sophistication to know and to understand what's in the drawings? This is really saying, owner says to the architect, give me your drawings and I'm going to take my drawings from my kitchen designer and I'm going to coordinate them. That normally doesn't happen. So it says provide for the coordination. So sometimes the owner will pass that off to the separate contractor. And the responsibility for the contractor and the main contractor is just to cooperate. So that's a little bit different. And the architect is the main architect isn't even identified here. If you remember in the B-101, there's a similar provision that says the owner's separate contractors shall coordinate and the architect will cooperate. And as I said, what I often do, because I represent a lot of owners, what I often do is I flip that and I make the architect responsible for all the coordination and the owner's separate contractors will cooperate. And that's what I'll do in this provision as well. For purposes of exam and purposes straight out of what learning this, you just need to go on here that it's the owner's responsibility to coordinate, which they will pass off to the separate contractors. But as a matter of course, for practicality and construction, you normally want to have just one entity doing it. So for the design coordination, the architect should do everything. For the construction coordination, the contractor should do everything. They'll charge you extra to coordinate your separate contractors, but that's worth the money most of the time because it's only one entity doing that, one carrying the responsibility or risk. Okay. It goes further, though. It says that the contractor has to cooperate, but the latter part says the contractor shall make any revisions to its construction schedule deemed necessary after a joint review. So the contractor can't completely pull back and say, well, they were coordinating and I had to follow them and there was a delay and so it's their fault. In this case, this contractor at a minimum has to recognize that work being performed by separate contractors, the kitchen installer or whomever it is, may impact the contractor's schedule and there needs to be communication between the parties with respect to that schedule impact. So the contractor can't come back a year later and say, well, the reason why we're late is because I didn't realize how much time your contractor was going to take. Well, you had an obligation, contractor under 613, to recognize it up front. Okay?
So if the contractor recognizes that, then the contract has no problem, right?
Yeah, so what the contractor is going to do, so the question was, is if he has, if the contractor recognizes and states it in the contract, there shouldn't be a problem, recognizing that there could be a schedule issue or whatever. Yeah, what the intent of this and some other provisions in this section, and all of Article 3, which is the contractor's obligations, is to foster communication. And so the goal here is to make sure shall make revisions to its construction schedule after there's this joint review and mutual agreement. So there's this discussion. This is obligating a discussion between the contractor and the owner's separate contractor, the owner's kitchen installer. And they're obligated to communicate with each other. And then the contractor, because it owns the whole project schedule, must adapt its project schedule to include what the parties agree. You think about it. I'm a contractor, I get the drawings, and I see this box that's open where the kitchen's going to go. I'm building a hotel. I build my schedule out, and I'm like, oh, well, I know how much it normally takes to install a kitchen, and we've done many hotels and everything else. So I plug in X number of weeks for all that work, depending on, how it's sequenced and everything else. Well, if it turns out it's some specialty kitchen with very high design and like completely different things, it's going to take much longer to build. And so the contractor's initial thought of this is going to be a basic kitchen, and how he builds his schedule will be changed after this discussion, the joint review and agreement, when the contractor learns that the owner wants something more. And so if the contractor gets this understanding, and they should learn this, and fails to adapt or adjust the schedule for the more detailed construction effort here, the contractor's on the hook, because it says, shall make any revisions to its schedule. So you want to make sure that the contractor's in there up front, modifying or adjusting the schedule to whatever that work that's being performed by other contractors. I have another example. I have a client that they had a very nice home, and they built a pool house and a pool, and it was a very specialized design. It was a saltwater pool, lots of other things for swimming and stuff, but it was the whole pool house and pool was done by an entirely different entity than the main contractor for the project. This was a multi-million-dollar project. The pool house and pool itself was a $2 million separate contract. They had to adjust their schedule to reflect, because there was going to be a new crew coming in, not the contractor's crew, a brand new crew that was going to be building this pool and pool house. So it's not just kitchens and anything else. It's anything where the owner wants to bring in their own specialty entity. Okay? 614, unless otherwise provided in the contract documents, then it goes on through, the owner or separate contracts shall have the same obligations and rights that the contractor has under the conditions of the contract. And this is separate contracts. This actually should be contractors. I apologize for the typo there. So basically, if you remember what I was just saying in the beginning of class, Article 5 is the subcontracts obligations. And as I said, you want to build or you want to write the subcontracts, so whatever the contractor owes to the owner, the subcontractor owes the same obligations. It's the flow-down provisions between owner to contractor to subcontractor. This provision is the same thing. This says, hey, if I'm a contractor and I have to do A, B, and C for the owner, and owner, you bring in your own contractor, they should have to do A, B, and C as well. We all want to be on the same page. I don't want them to have any more or less than me. I want to make sure that their obligations of safety and of site management and scheduling and all those things that are built into this agreement, you, owner, have an obligation to make sure your subcontractors are following, or your separate contractors are following the same rules. And it makes sense. I mean, think about it. I use this example all the time that a contract is just like the rules to playing Monopoly. So you start playing Monopoly, and somebody's the dog, and somebody's the shoe, and somebody's the iron, and you start playing, and a fourth person comes in, and they want to be, I don't even remember what else is the little toys on them, whatever. The money bags, they want to be the money bags. If they came in and were playing by different rules, that wouldn't be fair. So that's all this is saying, is we all need to play by the same rules. That's what 614 says. 6.2, mutual responsibility. the contractor shall afford the owner and separate contractors reasonable opportunity for introduction of storage of the materials and equipment, performance of activities, and shall connect and coordinate the contractor's construction and operations with theirs as required by the contract documents. Again, a very basic, simple concept, but it's good that it's in there. What this says is, you're going to come in and you're going to install that kitchen. Well, I know you're going to need a laydown area. You're going to have to where are you going to store your stoves, your ovens, your hoods? Where are you going to run your electrical cords? Where's your tiling going to be? Where's your millwork going to go? All of the things that the specialty contractor is going to bring in to build, they have to have a location. So, separate contractors need to have this for storage of their materials and equipment. There has to be this coordination, this working together between the contractor and the separate contractors. And in fact, on large projects, and I worked on many, many large projects, sometimes the laydown area can be one of the most critical things in the construction. You know, we think about it, like, I got the plant going on up in Wisconsin. It's 127 acres. They got plenty of places to spread out their steel. There's not going to be a problem with coordination. But another project I was working on was they were working on potentially doing the renovation of Belmont Parks, the horse place out in New York State. So you guys all familiar with the Belmont Stakes, the big horse race, one of the Triple Crown events? So that's a beautiful stadium. They were going to do a huge renovation. They're kind of going through stuff. It's on where Belmont is. It's on an area where the access road is very narrow, and the New York Islanders jumped in ahead of the game, and they're building a new $1.6 billion hockey arena, hockey and concert arena and everything else. There is one main access road to this site because the hockey arena is going to be right next to where the current Belmont Stakes are. One main road. And so the logistics of when the trucks are going in and out, there's a big discussion going on right now with the Islanders because during the weekend of the Belmont Stakes of whether they can actually have construction during that time because there's, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of people that come in to watch the horse race. So there's all these things that come in with coordination, and that's also what happens in here. So I had a project in New York City, and it was actually it was for a pumping warehouse, a pumping station that actually pumped all of the wastewater for the upper half of Manhattan. And all the pumps were 7 stories underground, and it was on this tiny little site that had no space around it, and they were able to procure like a parking lot like 3 blocks away, and that's where they had to have all this equipment, and there was these huge pumps. And so the logistics and the timing of who got this one parking lot at what time during the construction for coordination was huge. And if it didn't flow right, for example, if one entity was late in their delivery and the timing of when that, say for example, the steel, how long it took for the steel to be put onto the elevators and lowered down so that the next day somebody could bring in their electrical pumps or whatever it might be, it could potentially throw off the whole project by days or weeks. And so, as we all know, time is money. So coordination is really important, and that's what's talking about here. Coordinate the contractor's construction and operations as required by the contract document. And you figure all those out in the beginning. You constructability, logistics. You have long discussion on a tight site with something like this. 6.2. If part of a contractor's work depends on proper execution or results from construction or operations by the owner or a separate contractor, the contractor shall, prior to proceeding with that portion of the work, promptly notify the architect of the apparent discrepancies and defects in the construction or operations by the owner or separate contractors that would render it unsuitable for proper execution and results of the contractor's work. What does that all mean? All that means is if the contractor sees something that the owner's separate contractor is doing wrong or incorrect that impacts the general contractor's work, general contractors raise his hand. They're not taking responsibility for it, but they have to keep an eye on it. They have to give you notice. Now, most contractors will do this without much prompting. Because anytime they can push the blame off to somebody else, they'll write a letter, and that's good. And that's okay, too. The owner wants to know that. But this actually mandates them to do that. They have to make sure, and they have to say, hey, What's going on here? They're doing something. And it may be a delay issue, or it may be that their work is defective and they see that and they say, well, that could impact. If your specialty contractor is putting up a post and beam system and I'm building on the second floor and I see that there's problems with that construction that could cause a failure, I need to point that out. Now, further though, it says the contractor shall not be responsible for the discrepancies and defects in the construction operations that are not apparent. So this is again that check the math type thing, where the contractor, if it's reasonable and they see it, and a good prudent contractor would recognize these things, and there's a defect or a discrepancy, they need to point it out. If it's hidden, if they can't see it, if they didn't know it, if it happened while they were working on another side of the project, they aren't responsible for it. And ultimately, the separate contractor will always be responsible for any of its own failures. It's just the first part of the paragraph makes sure that the contractor can't completely remove itself. They have to have some obligation because they're running the overall project. Any questions on that? 623, the contractor shall reimburse the owner for costs that incur that if because of the contractor's delay. So if the contractor's late, contractor can't manage its site, and your specialty contractor comes in, the pool contractor comes in, and the hole hasn't been dug because the general contractor didn't do it right, and the pool contractor has to sit around for a couple of weeks and incur costs, the contractor has to pay the owner for those additional costs. Same thing the other way. If the contractor thought that the pool and the pool house were going to be completed on a certain date, and the contractor was going to then bring in its landscapers to finish out the project after the pool was completed, and the pool contractor is delayed, and the landscapers have to sit and wait for 2 or 3 weeks, the owner has to pay the contractor for those delays. Pretty basic stuff. And what's going to happen with that, when the owner has to pay the contractor for his delays, the owner's going to turn around and point to its pool contractor and say, I had to pay the contractor $100,000 because of your delays. You owe me $100,000 plus my legal fees. Something to that effect. 624, it just talks about if there's issues with partially completed construction, so it's similar to what we talked about in 623. 6.3, the owner's right to clean up. This is actually, in this instance, if the owner walks the site, and there's language in these contracts that they want it broom clean, they want it neat and orderly, whatever it might be, and if it turns out that the owner feels that the contractor is not keeping the site properly clean, the owner can step in and bring its own crew. Where this probably is going to come in or can come into place is lots of times in seasonal changes. Maybe they need to have snow fences up. Maybe they need to drain the water. Maybe there's areas where it could impact the owner's business. And so the owner's going to bring in somebody else because the contractor's not maintaining a clean site. The owner's allowed to do that. That's what this says here in 6.3. And the contractor has to pay for those additional costs if they didn't keep their project where it needs to be. All right. Any other questions on owners, separate contractors? Good. Article 7, changes in the work. I've used the word change order throughout the semester many times. We're finally getting to find out exactly how a change order works and what it's for, and that's what this article is for. Okay. Changes in the work may be accomplished after the execution of the contract by one of 3 ways. By a change order, by a constructive change directive, and then by a minor change in the work, which is like sometimes they call it a field change. Okay? A change order is based on an agreement between the owner, the contractor, and the architect. The architect is involved in the change order. A construction change directive requires agreement between the owner and the architect only, and may or may not be agreed to by the contractor. A minor change of the work can be just issued in the field by the architect. Okay, so what's the difference between them? On a big level, change order is kind of the end of the culmination of everything else. I'm going to do for you, the architect designed a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, and the contractor priced it out. I'm going to build that 3-bedroom, 2-bath house for $500,000. And then there's a change. They want it to be a 3-bedroom, 3-bath house. So the architect makes a design change that results in a pricing and schedule change, and that has to be written up. The architect does the drawings, the contractor prices it out, and they write it up for the additional bathroom to be located on the second floor this is the additional cost, and you write it up, and all three, the owner, the architect, and the contractor agree, they sign it, and it's a change order. The construction change directive, same scenario, but when the contractor comes back and says it's going to be $75,000 for the additional bathroom, the owner's like, are you crazy? And he looks at the architect and said, what did you design for me? What is on that? What's gold-plated in that bathroom? And the architect says, look, my costing looks like this is going to be about a $35,000 change. I don't know where the additional $40,000 is. And so the contractor says, well, but it affects my schedules, and it's really busy in the industry, and I can't get these specialty faucets, and I'm really thinking it's $75,000. And for a constructive change directive, in that instance, the owner and the architect agree that it's a $35,000 change, and they give a directive to the contractor. Do the work. I know you don't agree, and we don't agree on the price. Or maybe it's a schedule issue, but the three parties are not in agreement, so they're giving an order, a directive, to perform the work, and there's provisions later on in the contract to figure out how we're going to pay for that. How is it really going to, is it going to be the 35, is it going to be the 75, is it going to be somewhere in the middle? But the work needs to be performed until the parties come to an agreement. That's the constructive change directive. That's the difference between a change order where everybody agrees and they sign, and a constructive change order where they give them a directive, let's figure out the price or schedule later on. And the work order is like a minor change in the field. Architect's there, you know what? I don't like this eggshell white. I need dove white. That's a simple change. Gives the directive in the field. It's not a cost impact. It's not a schedule impact because they only painted up one half of a wall. That's going to be a field change. Something that the architect can just do. It's an aesthetic thing. It's not going to be a cost or schedule impact. Okay?
Sorry. What is the dove white? I should tell you it's much more expensive.
If it's more expensive, there is a cost impact, then you need a change order or a constructive change directive. So a field change, the minor change in work, is no cost, no time. Okay? And in fact, if it was, I don't like the white, I want it blue, that would be something that the owner should probably get approval on. That wouldn't be a minor field change either. It's minimal impact, it's a substitution, no cost, no time. That's what a work order in the field that requires no signature, okay? So. And then under 713, changes in the work, the contractor should be promptly with the change in the work. Went away there for a second. So that just means you got to keep moving. If there's a change, you got to keep moving the schedule. What's going on? Is it back? That's weird. I'm not going to touch this again except for what is going on? Huh. All right. Let's try this again. Okay. Let's see if this works again. All right. Sorry about that. Don't know what happened. Okay. So, 7.2. A change order is a change in the work, a change in the amount, or a change in the schedule. So the scope, we added a bathroom, it cost $35,000, it's going to add 3 weeks to the project. It can be one of any or all three together. It doesn't have to be all three, it doesn't have to be two, it can be one of all three or any of a combination of them. But it's a change to any one of those that causes the reason or need for a change order that you have to have a writing. 7.3, the Constructive Change Directive. As I said, it's a written order prepared by the architect and signed by the owner and the architect, but the adjustment to the sum or contract time, that comes later when they figure that out. And so it's just to continue to keep the work moving along. Ultimately, you're going to figure it out. You're going to figure out how much time it takes and how much more cost it is. It's just you want to keep the work progressing. Go ahead, question. Yeah, what will happen is that the architect will issue a change order request that it'll be an owner. Actually, while the architect's issuing, it's an owner-directed change. Contractor's going to price it. All the work, any change order is going to be priced out before the work happens, or almost all of it. Sometimes it's mandatory. You got to do it. You got to go. Emergency. But by and large, there's a process by which. And so when the contractor comes back with a price and a schedule that the architect and the owner don't agree with, then you have to negotiate. And so what you don't want to do is delay the project until you figure out what those prices are. And so the contractor is given this directive to continue to work and proceed. Don't wait on this. We want the work done. We're in agreement that it's got to be done. You understand what the scope is. Let's just figure out price and time as it moves along. So that's what 731 says. 732 is the constructive change shall be used in the absence of a total agreement, and the adjustments can be based on the following. So here's how they're going to adjust it. Eventually, they're going to come to a mutual lump sum. So the contractor comes back and says, I can do it for 75. The owner says, the architect says it should be 35. And somewhere along the way, they agree it's going to be 50. And that's a negotiation, but you don't want to wait till the negotiation's done. They're already doing the work. Unit prices can be done. So unit prices is, say, for example, how many linear feet. They're not sure how many linear feet of piping is going to be used for the bathroom. So we've agreed that it's going to be $5 a linear foot. And we've all agreed on that price. And then the contractors could come back later and say it was 100 linear feet as opposed to 75. And then they'll know what the price is. But they've agreed to that unit price up front. Cost can be determined a matter agreed upon between the parties. So they got to figure it out. Should it be a percentage? Should it be as actual cost? Do they actually do a time and material? So that's one. As provided in 734, which we'll get to in a second. In 734 says if the contractor does not respond promptly or disagrees with the method for the adjustment of the contract sum, the architect shall determine the adjustment. So the architect's going to say what it really is. The architect's going to say it's 35. And then the contractor says, I don't agree with the 35, but that's what you write up in the constructive change directive. So the owner and the architect kind of stake their place. They put their foot in the ground, and this is where we are. And then the contractor, though, comes in and it keeps itemized accounting with the actual work being performed. Backup. Here are how many hours my laborers did. Here are the actual costs of my materials. Here's any permits that I had. And so what they're going to say is, I don't agree with your $35,000, Mr. Owner and Architect, but I'm going to track my actual costs, and I'm going to give you backup for everything. And we're done? That's what you're going to pay me. It may not be 75. It may be 90. But I'm going to keep that track. And so that's how you kind of go through it. So sometimes the owners might want to say, well, gosh, do I really want to take the risk of standing my ground to 35 and I could maybe get the deal done and negotiate it for 50 instead of the 75, because if I take the risk, it may cost me 90 or something. Who knows? So sometimes there's that's part of the art of the negotiations, kind of how you want to get the deal done. So, and what they track in 734.1, it's the cost of labor, the cost of materials, point 2, rental costs of machinery, cost of premiums or bonds, and cost of supervision, the people on the project site. All of those will be tracked. And the contractor keeps all those as separate line items, hands the bills to the owner and says, your new bathroom cost you $82,673.14. I'm not taking the 35, I'm taking the 82,000. That's how that works. So, if the contractor disagrees in the construction, in the adjustment to the time, because the architect's going to say, well, it probably adds about 3 weeks to the schedule. If the contractor disagrees with that, then the contractor has an obligation to make a claim under Article 15, which we'll get to a little bit later on. But it's a process by which they make a claim. So So in that case, they don't necessarily track the same way and hand it, and you're automatically allowed to, but they do need to track how the impact is. You had a question? Yes. Yeah, most often the constructive change directive is going to come in place. This is almost 95% of the time the constructive change directive is used. Change order is drawn up, the scope is defined, the contractor comes out, gives a time and schedule, and it's bid coming back. Most of the time the disagreement is over the price. Sometimes the disagreement, they say, oh, we can do it for $50,000, but it's going to take us an extra 6 weeks. And the owner's like, that's crazy, because my architect says it's 2 to 3 weeks to add that bathroom. Sometimes that happens, but it's in the very vast minority. Most of the time it's the price. And so what you want to do is to preserve, maybe the architect says 3 to 4 weeks, or 2 to 3 weeks, and the contractor says 3 to 4 weeks. You don't want to quibble about that, because if you can lock down the price for that, even if the schedule gets extended, they're not getting any more money, because time is money. If it's 6 weeks, every week that the contractor's on, they get paid at the end of the job. But so what you'll do is you're not going to necessarily 100% agree to that 3 to 4 right out of the box, but that's why you want them to start the work. They're working on it while you continue to negotiate. You may say, it's not worth the negotiation. I'm really confident that your numbers are going to come in closer to mine than yours. Just give me your T&M breakdown. But if you think there's a risk, because who knows, then you continue to negotiate while the work's being performed, and you say, I want to hedge my bet. I want to secure this risk. I'm going to do it with you for 50. Will you agree with me 50? Yes, I'll do it for 50. And then if the contractor spends 70 or 80, well, that's their problem, not yours, because you've already locked it in at 50. So that's kind of how the process will work. 7535, the contractor, this is what I said. If there's time issues, they can make a claim under 15, and we'll get to 15 on how to make a claim for time. 736, upon receipt of the constructive change directive, here's the answer: the contractor shall promptly proceed with the change of the work. And then they'll advise the architect and the contractor of the disagreement with that intent. So 736 says, contractor, you gotta go. You gotta start working, because we want to keep the schedule going. And then a constructive change directive that's ultimately signed by the contractor, whatever's written on that CCD is sometimes what they call them, CCD. What's written on that, when the contractor signs it, it becomes a change order, because now all three people have signed it. The owner, the architect, and the contractor are all there, and that's what it says. It immediately shall be recorded as a change order. Now, if you want to talk about why this is important here, is in the project, in the process of a construction project, you're going to have pay applications. I'm going to build your house for $1 million. Original cost, $1 million. Your first pay application, your invoice. Contractor is going to be invoicing for $250,000. Amount remaining in contractor, $750,000. And that's what your traditional pay application is going to look like. But let's say there was a $100,000 change order to add a new room, a family room. So it's going to say original contract amount, $100,000. Amount paid to date, $250,000. Amount of change orders, it'll say $100,000. Amount remaining, new adjusted contract amount, $1.1 million. Amount remaining to be finished, $850,000 worth of work. So that change order is going to be identified, that $100,000. You may have another change. It's the family room, then it's a bathroom, then it's a plumbing issue, then it's a roofing change. Who knows what they might be? And so you need to track these change orders, and they're tracked by numbers. And so what you're going to have is sometimes there's a whole bunch of mini change order requests that they lump all together. So you're going to have this schedule that's going to have all the change orders, and a CCD isn't going to be on that schedule. It's going to be sitting out there on its own. So you need to convert it to a change order and say, well, this will be now called change order 6. And it's identified, and those become part of the contract. So it's a mechanical process more than anything else. Okay? Yeah. When the contractor signs, yes.
Does the contractor only sign once they've agreed on the time and money?
Yeah. So what'll happen is there'll be initial owner-driven change request. Sometimes it's called a COR, change order request, and it can be an owner COR, it can be a contractor COR. Both sides can answer them. Contractor may be like, as I've used as an example, digging, I find soil problems, so I want a COR because nobody knew that. So you got to pay me more money, and then we figure it out. But in the instance where a CCD comes into place, the owner has this directive, they all want it done, and you write up the CCD. New bathroom, here's the drawing, see attached, $35,000, 3-week schedule extension. That's what's written up. Contractor's like, I don't want to do this, I don't agree, blah, 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 but they start doing the work. When they eventually either negotiate on the $50,000 deal, or eventually the contractor comes in and says, here's all my invoices for $82,000, that CCD is modified, and it comes to be whatever the price is. It goes from 35, it goes 50, or becomes the 82,000. The schedule goes from 3 weeks to 4, or whatever that might be, and then you write it up as a change order. If, however, sometimes it stays the same. Contractor's like, okay, fine, I'll do it. And then they sign it, and you don't have to create it. But when you sign it, then you still have to call it change order 6. But sometimes that CCD doesn't look the same when it's finally signed at the end. Does that answer your question? Okay, great. 739, pending a final determination of the total cost of the CCD to the owner, the contractor may request payments of work complete under the Constructive Change Directive in its application for payment. And the architect will make an interim determination. This comes into play in 2 instances. One, it's a very long, drawn-out negotiation. And so the contractor's like, this is taking months and months because we're not sure. I can't carry your costs. In January, I had $32,000 worth of labor and materials. You got to pay me for that. Even though we haven't decided whether the final price is going to be 35 or 50 or 82, here are my invoices, and you must pay me for that. And the owner does have to pay. That's what's going to happen. They get paid during that. Now, the architect can make a determination, an interim determination, to make sure that those bills are valid. But if they are bills for the work being performed, by and large, the owner's going to have to pay for it. So that's one instance where the negotiations are taking a really long time. Another instance is the same thing where it goes from pay application to pay application, but they've agreed to a number, just the architect and the paperwork hasn't been done. So the contractor's like, okay, we've all agreed to $50,000, but you still have to pay me for last month's $32,000. And whatever I'm going to spend this month, I know I'm not going to spend any more than an additional 18. I'm never going to go over 50. But we're not going to wait 2 months for me to be paid for the work I did last month. So that's all this is saying. 739 says, hey, as I continue, since we haven't agreed to the pricing, I'm not your bank. I do the work. I got to pay my subs. You got to pay me to pay my subs. Pretty simple. And the owner has to buy into that. And that's an incentive, again, like I said, why the owner wants to try to negotiate that, maybe that $50,000 number, because if it continues to go on, if month 1 is 32 and they haven't locked in the 50, month 2 may be another 40. Who knows what it is? So that's one of the reasons why. And as the months keep going and you haven't locked down that CCD, the owner has to keep writing checks. So that's an incentive to keep the owner moving as well. 7310, when the owner-contractor agree and a termination's been made, shall be effectively immediately, and the architect will prepare the change order. So that's the physical thing. That $35,000 CCD, they will physically rewrite it as a change order, and then that's going to be issued to take place of the CCD. Okay? 7.4, minor changes in the work. They're consistent with the intent of the contract documents. They don't involve adjustment in the sum or the time. And if the contractor believes that a minor change in the work will affect the contract sum or time, the contractor has to notify the architect and does not perform the work. So this is a little different. With the Constructive Change Directive, everyone knows there will be an impact to time or money or both. And the contractor, because we all know, we just haven't figured out what those are, the contractor must perform the work. The architect, though, when they order a minor change in the work, if the contractor believes there's going to be an impact to time or money, the contractor stops and doesn't perform the work. So your example, what happens if we went from eggshell white to dove white, and the dove was much more expensive? The contractor has an obligation to say, that paint is twice as much. I need a change order for that. This is not just a field work directive. And so I'm not going to do that work until you either write me a CCD or you write me a change order. So that's the obligation of the contractor, is they need to stop. And then it says if the contractor performs the work without such notice, right here, if they do the work without notifying, they waive any adjustment. So if the contractor listens to the architect and the architect says, change this eggshell to dove white, the contractor says, great. His painter goes out, buys the dove white, comes back, paints the room dove white, and the painting costs are 3 times as much. If the contractor didn't tell anybody, they can't charge that. The contractor has to eat that loss. So, most contractors don't fall into this trap, but occasionally it does happen, and this is why this is here. Litigation, this is one of those provisions I guarantee you that wasn't around when it first was drafted, but was put in because there was lawsuits where the contractor's like, well, it was a lot more expensive, I didn't know, and then they're like, yeah, but you did it. You did the work. You got to tell us if it's going to cost more. And then I'll go back to my architect and say, I'm really fine with the eggshell white, not the dove white. The Constructive Change Directive?
Yeah, the Constructive Change Directive. He would have opportunity until they are doing contract.
So what's going to happen is the contractor doesn't issue a CCD. Contractors receive the construct. The reason why it's a Constructive Change Directive is because the contractor doesn't agree with the owner and the architect.
Yes, that does something.
Yeah.
In the paragraph you have there, it states that the contractor has the ability to
To stop the work. Yeah. Yes. There's going to be 2 options here. Under minor changes of the work 7.4, the question is what basically the question I think if I gather is if this issue comes up and the contractor knows it's more expensive, is that when a constructive change directive comes into place? It can. There's going to be one of two things that will happen. Is the contractor is directed by the architect in the field to do a certain change. And the contractor, if there's going to be no price impact and no time impact, will just do the work. That's a field order, no big deal. But if there's going to be a price impact or a schedule impact, the contractor says, stop. Here's what the price impact is or the schedule impact. The architect then must issue either a change order because the architect agrees with the price and schedule impact that the contractor has identified, or if the architect doesn't agree, they'll issue the CCD, they'll direct the contractor to do the work, and we'll figure out the price and time later. So let me give you an example of what happened to me. So I bought my very first condo or townhome I bought was a 4-story townhome, and the pad had been poured, and they had already framed the first level when I purchased. And they had already put floors down, and they were starting to frame up the second and the third level. I came in and made some changes. There was a half wall in the kitchen. I blew it out to be more loft open-like and some other stuff in some of my designs. And I drew up the designs, and I presented them to the builder-developer. And the one thing that was infuriating to me was in the hallway in the upstairs on the third level between the 2 bedrooms, I had them fur out this teeny tiny little 1-foot wide linen closet, floor to ceiling, and it literally it had them, because there was going to be a wall there, they had to put 2 more 2x4s here. That was all it was. And they wrote a change order for that because there was 2 more 2x4s. I'm like, this is crazy. I thought that should have been a field change. But their position, and I think it's right, was, but we had 2 more 2x4s. That's materials at the very least. Now, of course, they charged me a lot more, and there was labor involved and everything else, and it was a lot more, it was the most expensive 1-foot by 1-foot linen closet I could ever imagine, but that's just life. But that was where I thought it should have been a field change. They came back and said it should have been a change order. The developer came to me and said, here's a change order, you're going to sign this. and I signed it and we moved on. But that's how that went along. That's one way it could come into play. Okay? All right, that's it for the difference between a change order, a CCD, and a field order by the architect. All right, Article 8, time. So now we'll talk about time. So what are we going to do about time here? Okay. Unless otherwise provided, the contract is a period of time including authorized adjustments allotted in the contract documents for substantial completion. S and C capitalized. Substantial completion as a term, and I think it's in like 9.8, is when the building is fit for its intended use and purposes. The toy factory can make toys. The homeowner can live in the home. The hospital can receive patients. It's going to operate as its function. So the time is the contract time, capital C, capital T, is from the beginning when the contractor first starts, mobilization shows up with its first truck, till the building is substantially complete. That's your project schedule. And those are two critical dates: commencement date, substantial completion date. There may be all these little milestones in between, but the two most important are commencement and substantial completion in every construction contract. Okay? And the date of substantial completion is the date certified by the architect. So the contractor is going to come in and they're going to say, we're substantially complete, you can start making your toys. And the architect's going to walk around the site, one of you guys, and you're going to walk around and you're going to say yes or no. No, I don't think it's substantially complete. They aren't finished with X, they aren't finished with Y. Substantial completion is not final. It is not 100%. It is the building is fit for its intended use and purposes, but it's not 100% complete. They may need some touch-up paint. They need fix some floor tiles, punch list type stuff. That's substantial completion. And it's the architect who makes that determination, not the contractor. The contractor will wave its hand, I'm substantially complete. The architect's the person that's going to say yes or no. 8.2, progress and completion. Time limits stated in the contract documents are of the essence of the contract. And the contractor confirms that the contract time is a reasonable period for performing the work. So this time limit is an interesting thing. Like I said, we have commencement and we have substantial completion. 18 months, 274 days, whatever it is, beginning to end. There may, however, be what's called intra-milestones, other triggers in the contract. And when it says of the essence, that means if they miss a date that has been identified as a critical date, a milestone date, or substantial completion, the contractor is in breach of contract. They have failed to perform because they have blown the schedule. So an owner is going to say, contractor, give me a schedule. The contractor breaks out this schedule and it's going to say, well, here's where electrical starts, and here's where plumbing starts, and here's where carpentry starts, and here's where the windows are installed, and the doors are installed, and the floors, and all the millions of things that are going on in a construction project. And the owner is going to say, every single date on this contract, on this schedule, every single one are critical because this contract provision, 821, says the time limits, and there's no definition of what that is, are of the essence. Now, that's not practical in the real world because sometimes things get shifted and moved around. So you want to have discussions with your contractor to figure out what are the real critical milestone dates. But a literal interpretation of 821 says every single date on that contract are set in stone, and if the contractor fails to meet anyone, they're in breach of contract. Like I said, it's not practical, it doesn't make sense, but that's the literal interpretation of this. It's also, the contract says it's reasonable. The contractor's agreeing in this provision. Hey, it's reasonable. I can do all these. I can make these times. So that's their agreement. They're buying off into it. 822. The contractor shall not knowingly, except for agreement by the owner in writing, commence work prior to the effective date of the insurance being required. So you don't want a contractor to start the project without being insured. You know, somebody could slip and fall on day one. And if they don't have the insurance in place, that's bad because somebody's got to pick up those costs. So that's a pretty simple one. 723. They shall proceed as expeditiously with the adequate forces. They got to have enough manpower, enough people doing the work to achieve substantial completion within the contract time. Yeah, I got to have time and materials and labor and everybody else to make sure I can hit that 274-day schedule. schedule or whatever it might be. Delays and extensions. This is what the contractors write letters all the time about. If the contractor is delayed in any time or the commencement of the project work by an act or neglect of the owner, the architect, or of a separate contractor, or by changes in the order of work, by labor disputes, by delay authorized by the owner, or other cause, then the contractor shall be extended for such reasonable time as the architect may determine. So what's going to happen is, if any one of these 5 things happen, contractors should write a letter or an email or some type of notice to provide and say, hey, there was a delay that the owner offered because there was a mediation. So let's say there was a dispute over something on the project, and the owner said, well, let's hold off on continuing work because we need to have this mediation to figure out. Sometimes you have real-time mediations on projects. Or there's a change. You added a bathroom. All of those things are a reason, and it says the contract time shall be extended. The contractor is given an extension to the schedule. But the architect is kind of the final one to make that decision. Remember in the B-101 we had this term called the initial decision maker. The architect was going to be wearing that hat as a neutral. Here's one of the times where the architect steps in and says, contractor says 4 weeks. I say 3. I don't agree with that. We're going to give an extension of the contract for 3 weeks. That may result in a CCD as they figure out what that is. But it's the architect that kind of has that decision-making authority. Any questions on that? Yeah. Oh, back a slide, I'm sorry, yeah. Okay. A-203, yeah. That's a great question. What are adequate forces to make sure you get the project done on time? Really good question. Because every contractor is going to say when they man up the project, whether it's a kitchen renovation like my wife and I had that was supposed to be done in 6 weeks and it took almost 13, or whether it's a $200 million facility, the contractor is the obligation to make sure that that is adequately staffed. And they are all going to go in saying, we think this is how much time it's going to take, and this is what we believe there are enough people. And then when the project is delayed and the owner is now incurring costs because they can't start making their toys, or they can't eat in the kitchen, or whatever it might be, to the extent that the owner incurs losses or damages from that, the owner is going to argue you didn't properly staff the project. And then that becomes, when it comes on my desk, if it's a dollar figure large enough to hire a lawyer, then I'm going to hire a scheduling expert, and that scheduling expert's going to get somebody and they're going to look at the manpower graphs, and they're going to see how many men and women are actually performing the work. And was it reasonable? We had a project for a power plant in Missouri, and they had this one. They were putting in a boiler to superheat the water to get the steam flowing that turns the turbine that makes electricity. Okay, the boiler had thousands and thousands of pipes, like you see in the back of the room, and those pipes, though, because they're having water at a super critical point. This water was in like thousands of degrees. It wasn't the steam and everything. It wasn't boiling point at 200 degrees. This was in 1600 degrees. So they had to have these very specialized wells for the pipes when they connected pipe to pipe to pipe. The contractor believed that they had sufficient number of welders on the project site when they put together their project constructability plan. It turned out that the type of welders that they had enough manpower for were not available for the project because it was a specialty weld. There was also issues with the type of material that the pipes were made out of because it was a newer alloy. And so it required a special weld and a special type of welding, and that weld took longer, and they needed more people. And so the whole project, the whole litigation dispute, because this was millions of dollars of additional time and cost in this, came down to whether the contractor adequately had enough welders to support the completion dates for that one element of the project. And this project had a number of milestone dates, so we didn't have to worry about whether they could make it up on the back end and hit substantial completion. We were talking about the cost in this very narrow window of the installation of this boiler and the supercritical issues of that. And that was based on adequate forces. Contractor said we had enough. We said we didn't. And then we brought in an expert to try to show why one side was right over the other. That's where. So the question is, who determines what adequate forces is? At the outset, it's the contractor. If something goes wrong, it's the lawyers, it's the experts, it's the judge, it's the jury that figures out in which side you want to agree, which is adequate.
What do you, is there any means to prevent situations where the contractor goes beyond adequate, like higher wall?
Have more? Have too many? Yeah, so that's another way you want to look at it. So sometimes, are they overstaffing it? Are they having too many people on it? And how you want to handle that is you want to handle that in the beginning of the project of how you negotiate. So if you negotiate a lump sum project, I'm going to build this facility for you for $212 million. The owner doesn't care if they have too many workers on the project site because it's not going to go over $212 million because they got a lump sum, it's got a cap. If it's cost plus with a guaranteed maximum price, which we talked about that a little bit about, so it's actual cost of the work, but it's still got this guaranteed maximum price cost cap, the owner's not going to be as much worried either because there's still a cap. The owner would like it to be lower than that, that's the whole point, but it won't be as less. But if it's a cost plus and it's an open-ended agreement, then of course the owner's going to have an issue with that. And are there going to be issues or reasons why the contractor's trying to pad it? So there are ways that you negotiate up front of what the deal is that can impact whether you care whether there's too many workers or not. Obviously, you always want to have enough, so if there's too few, that's going to be an issue regardless of what you negotiated up front. But if it's too many, because sometimes too many can impact other workers. If there's too many people in one area, you have too many welders in one spot, you don't have room for the other carpenters and the other people to do the work around it. And that could delay the project. So too many is not as good for certain reasons. And so then, as the projects get larger and the risks are higher, the owner is often going to hire their own people to do what's called project controls. And that owner's representative, a separate third party that the owner is going to have sitting on their side, not the architect or the engineer, but a separate entity, that individual or that company is going to be being the watchdog and checking the math of the various people and numbers and time and manpower and all this other stuff. And that's very critical. For large projects, that could be potentially tens of millions of dollars of how they're staffing a project. Project manager? Well, the project manager can be on the contractor side, could be an owner, the architect. Every project, every discipline, contractor, design professional, owner, are all going to have their own project manager. This individual, this entity that's going to be doing what's called project controls or overseeing it, could be the owner's representative, and the owner's project management could be wearing multiple hats. Project manager is normally just the person that we identify as kind of the point person. But yes, that is a project management element of managing time and money and schedule and manpower. And there's stuff called earned value. There's all these things. We could spend an entire class or entire semester on the specialty elements of project controls and how to manage large-scale projects. And in fact, various universities, their engineering schools have classes just as that. One of my partners teaches a class at Northwestern on this very issue. And it's the whole semester. So, okay. Moving on. Article 9, payments and completion. So, how do we get paid? What do we get paid? Well, here, the contract sum, capitalized term, is the total amount payable to the owner and the contractor for performance of the work. Owner and contractor only. It doesn't include the architect. So if you remember, the cost of the work is just the cost to build it. It's not the real estate costs. It's not the architect's fees. So when an owner goes in and says, I got $2 million to build this house, and that's all in, well, they got to remember, they got to pay an architect, they got to pay the fees, they got to have the real estate, and then whatever's left over is for the cost of the work. And that becomes the contract sum. 9.2. Unit prices are stated in the contract document, and there are quantities originally contemplated if their material changed, such that there is a substantial inequity to the owner or the contractor, then the unit prices shall be equitably adjusted. So what is this here? So unit prices, as I said, is so for sometimes Sometimes piping, copper is going to be priced out of the linear foot. How many dollars per linear foot? Sometimes bricks. How many linear per unit brick? Concrete roadways. How many cubic yards of concrete are going to be poured? That's how you price things out, by units. What happens here, so you got to state that up front. My unit prices for the various elements, if you have that. Not every contract has unit prices. But if there is a change that has an inequity to the owner or the contractor, then you can adjust that. So where this comes into play, this came in, a good example in 9.2 is, so going back in the early 2000s, early to mid 2000s, there was a lot of work going on in China. I mean, there still is a lot of construction in China, but such that they were buying almost like a huge percentage of the rare metals that were being on the world, on the planet. Copper, gold, silver, for wires, for plumbing, for various electronics, things that were going into the buildings. They were buying all the raw materials. And as a result of that, or even steel, drywall was going through the roof. Because there wasn't enough supply, because it was all being bought, the prices went through the roof. And so if you price out, in fact, there were buildings out on the East Coast, like a number of them in New York, that started under construction, high-rises, that couldn't be finished because the contractor was going to lose so much money. They said, I'll build you this high-rise for $128 million. They priced it out at market rates. They started construction. China came in and bought up the market such that steel, drywall, copper, silver, tin went through the roof. That $120 million high-rise went to $250, almost doubled in some instances. It was ridiculous. And the contractors just walked away and left a bunch of superstructures just sitting there because they couldn't do that. Now, hopefully it's not so bad, but that's what has to happen in this instance. If there is a price that's outside, so if the unit price is agreed to, and it adjusts, it's called escalation, then this says they need to be equitably adjusted. Now, sometimes the owner is just saying, well, it's not equitable to me too. If the cost of the building is twice as much, you promised to do it for me $120, I'm not going to pay you the $200, whatever it is. There's all different things. And you can add clauses for escalation, and you have to look at the market. And this is somewhat of a forecasting and communication between the owner and the contractor. But the purpose of 9.2 is to make sure we decided on this unit cost. It was too much. Later, we need to make an equitable adjustment. One other area that 9.2 will come into place is if you're doing, like I got a project right now that's going where they're doing tuck pointing and sealing the building. They're fixing the brick and everything else. And they're doing it per brick. Some of it's per square foot, and some of it's actually per pieces of masonry unit. We're pulling out this brick and putting a new one in. Sometimes when you pull out that brick, what you find behind the wall, it's affecting the bricks on the backside. They looked really nice on the front, but you thought you were going to do 3, now it's going to be 20. That would be another place where the brick price stays the same, but the number of bricks that have to be replaced go up, and therefore there's an equitable adjustment there to the contract. Schedule of values, 9.2. So schedule of values is a list. It's a stipulated sum, or when you're doing a stipulated sum, which is a lump sum, or guaranteed maximum price, the contractor needs to submit what's called a schedule of values. And that's before the first pay application. And then it's going to be pointing out what the prices of the work are for the project. So this schedule, unless objected to, it shall be used as a basis for reviewing the contractor's applications for payment, and any change to the schedule of values should be submitted to the architect for review. So a schedule of values is going to be a list of all of the work that's going to be done on the project. It's going to say excavation, footings, concrete, steel, rough carpentry, finished carpentry, electrical, plumbing, lighting. Every single discipline that's going to be in the building, you're going to identify it as a category. And then the next column is going to have a price. And then the next column after that may actually have a time frame, but it's going to be ultimately show whether it's percent complete or how much is coming out of the price. It's just a list of all of the trades and all the disciplines that when it gets to the very bottom, if it's that $1 million house, it's going to add up to $1 million. all the various things. That's called a schedule of values. It's the value of each line item of work being performed. And it includes even the contractor's overhead and profit and fees. All going to be listed there in the schedule of values. So they need to submit that so the owner knows what the project price is going to be and see how the bills are going. The reason why it's only in a lump sum or a guaranteed maximum price is because if it's just a cost of the work with the open-ended, and the contractor's just one by one every month giving you his backup invoices. So they don't have the schedule values for that. Does that make sense what that is? This is so if you have when you put together the exhibits for a construction contract, you're going to have the drawings and specifications. That's the most important because they need to build from that. They're going to have the project schedule. That's the second most important, of timing. They're going to have the price. And then they're going to have the schedule of values. Those are the things you want to have on every contract. So you know who, what, where, how, and when. And the schedule of values is the what and how much. And that's going to be listed there. .3, applications for payment, otherwise known as the contractor's invoice. Now interestingly enough, they call it an application for payment as opposed to an invoice because when they submit it, as we'll see as we go through this, the architect gets to review and may not agree with it, so that's why it's an application for payment, and it may ultimately be revised and changed. But by and large, it's already been, hopefully everybody's agreed to it. So it says, the contractor shall submit to the architect an itemized application for payment prepared in accordance with the schedule of values. So it's going to look, so you have the schedule of values with 25 line items, and it's going to have in the beginning, the very top, excavation, foundations, steel. And so the very first pay application, and then as it goes down, it has carpentry and finished carpentry and windows and things. That very first pay application is going to have the very same line items as the schedule values. They're going to look exactly like each other. Except if it's the first pay app, it's only going to have money being requested for excavation and foundations because that's all the work that's been done. You're not going to see, unless they had to pre-order windows and doors, anything down below. But that's what it's going to do. It's going to reflect and look like the schedule of values. And it's to support all the data substantiating the contractor's right for payment that the owner or the architect shall require. Sometimes the owner wants to see very detailed backup. I want to see all the timesheets. Sometimes they just want to see an invoice from the subcontractor. So this is you have to determine what the owner and the architect require. What's the backup necessary? Sometimes an application for payment, especially on a lump sum, will be based only on what's called the percentage of completion. So I got a schedule of values. And it says, excavation, $300,000. And the first payment application comes in and says, excavation, you owe me $150,000. Presumably, that means that 50% of the work was done. So the architect takes that pay application, they walk out to the project site, and they see half a hole. Or maybe they don't see any hole. And they make a determination, is it really percentage complete? They're not asking for the backup. They're not looking for the invoices from the excavator of how much the backhoe rental was, or how many of the man hours, or how much cubic yards of dirt were hauled off. The architect on a percent complete will make a visual inspection to determine whether, in fact, the contractor has finished 50% of that. So that's one of the specialty things that architects and actually banks, they have the whole construction lending office. They walk the project sites and look to see percent complete. So they may require very minimal backup. But if it's cost plus or GMP, they want to see every invoice. So it just depends on what your deal is. So that's what this is here. Any questions on that? 9.3.1.1. As provided in 7.3.9, that's the change order sections. The applications may include requests for payments on account of changes in the work that have been properly authorized as a CCD, but are not yet as a change order. So, as I was saying before, you may have not agreed to the price of the CCD or the change order, but the contractor doesn't want to be the bank, so they are allowed to invoice before that CCD has been approved. And so you're allowed to put that price on your application for payment. (9.3.1.2) application for payment shall not include request for payments for which the contractor does not intend to pay a subcontractor. Now that's kind of like, well, why would they have that on there? Why would they say? Well, it's because sometimes contractors will invoice and they have a dispute with the subcontractor that the work wasn't performed. They're withholding, or maybe they are invoicing in advance. I know I'm going to be paying my subcontractor. I have a deal with my steel supplier for $200,000. That steel is currently being fabricated. I have a contract. I have an invoice, or I have a proposal, but I haven't been invoiced by that steel fabricator. The contractor cannot pre-bill you for work that they are not intending to pay that next pay application. There's all this prompt payment language and everything else. But you will find that contractors try to front-load projects, try to put as much billing up front as they can, long lead items and otherwise. But if they have not or don't have an obligation yet to pay a sub, they can't invoice you. Eventually they will, but not at that point early. 932, unless otherwise provided contract documents, payment shall be made on account of materials and equipment delivered and suitably stored at the site. So this is actually kind of an important point that often is lost on owners and how this is written up. We tweak this a little bit when I do my contracts. I had a project once where an owner ordered a piece of equipment that was worth about $30 million. It was delivered to the project site, and it was stored in the fence right outside the project site. The owner paid for it, but didn't get title because it had not been brought over. And there was a dispute because the language didn't talk about title turning over until the project was completed. And so there was a huge dispute in the project about the owner and contractor and who was going to do certain work. And the owner had already paid the $30 million for this piece of equipment that you could see. It was literally on the other side of a chain link fence. But the owner didn't own it and didn't have title. And that was a big mistake by the owner, obviously. And the contractor ultimately, in the dispute, used it as leverage to get more money. Said, you pay me on these change orders, and I'll put that piece of equipment on your property, and you can use it. And the owner's like, but I already paid for it. Like, yeah, but the contract doesn't require me to turn it over until the end of the project. And you owe me elsewhere, and they use it as leverage. So this one talks about it needs to be made on account of materials and equipment delivered and suitably stored at the site. So here you want to make sure that the owner doesn't pay for it until it's delivered and they have it, and then you talk about getting title and everything else. You could also have things stored off the site, equipment suitably stored off the site at a location agreed upon in writing. In this instance, it was literally off the site by a fence link, but it wasn't agreed to who was going to have ownership. So what we put into our contracts is we talk about that if there is off-site storage, title passes to the owner upon payment of invoice. So you don't care where it is in the world, the owner owns it, and you don't find yourself in this position. So that's what you want to do. Make sure that you have your owner. And you're going to be in the position sometimes as the architect of advising your owner about that, and you make sure they understand. Payment doesn't mean you get title. You need to write that in. Upon payment, title has been transferred. 933. And this is what it says in this contract, which helps it. The contractor warrants that all title to all work covered by the application for payment will pass to the owner no later than the date of payment. So this contract covers it. This contract is written in to say, when you pay, title has transferred. Other ones do not. The one that we had with this $30 million piece of equipment off-site did not have that language. It wasn't a form like this. And then it also says, the contractor is making on best knowledge, information, and belief that the property is free of all liens, claims, security interests, encumbrances in favor of the contractor, subcontractors, meaning nobody else has a claim to that. Sometimes you may find a situation where that big piece of equipment that's being delivered, the manufacturer of that hasn't been paid themselves. And so they may have a lien against that. And so here the contractor's saying, hey, when you pay me and you get it, I'm telling you that you're getting it free and clear. That gets into mechanic lien issues, which we'll talk a little bit later in this agreement. Any questions on this so far? 9.4, certificate of payment. So the contractor has provided you, the owner, an application for payment, and it's up to the architect to review that. When the architect reviews it, according to this contract, within 7 days after receipt of the contractor's pay application, they either issue to the owner a certificate of payment saying, I agree, and you're allowed to pay for the full amount, or they issue a certificate of payment for such amount that you determine is properly due, so something less than the full amount, or withhold certificate of the entire application for payment, saying that they have, and providing a reason for the withholding of the entire payout. 3 often does not happen, but it could be if there's some major breach in the contract and you want to withhold. 2 happens very frequently, especially if you're on a percent complete. That example that I had, contractor had a $300,000 excavation. They bill $150,000. The architect walks out and sees less than half a hole dug. They're going to say, you're not at 50%. Contractor's going to say, yeah, but we had to rent the backhoe, we had all these other costs, and the architect, and we'll figure that out. And so they'll withhold payment of a certain number of what they feel is fair and accurate. A prudent way to avoid 2 and 3 occurring is for the architect and the contractor and the owner to do what's called a pencil draft. That's not in the agreement, but this is something you guys will probably do. So, the pay applications typically due the first of the month, the 30th, somewhere around the end of the month, the beginning of the next month, for the work that was performed in the past. What you'll often have the parties do is on day 20, they sit down, and the contractor has already prepared a draft, they call it a pencil draft, of the application for payment. Because they know what the cost they've had up to 20 days, they know how many man hours and what materials are going to be able, and they know what materials are going to be delivered over the next 10 days and how many man hours are going to be worked, so they can make a projection to kind of fill in the blanks. And so they sit down between the parties and say, we're going to go over the pencil draft, and at that point in time, the architect can also make estimates. And so what they try to do, the parties, they try to come to an agreement between each other of what the value should be. And so that the numbers in the pencil draft on January 20th may be tweaked a little bit when it's submitted on January 31st, or whatever the dates are. So that's some way you can avoid a partial certification or a no certification, and always get the number 1 here, a certification for payment, is by making sure the parties agree before that real final invoice is submitted. 9.4.2, the issuance of certificate for payment will constitute a representation by the architect to the owner based on their evaluation of the work. And remember, to the best of the architect's information, knowledge, and belief, this is language from the B-101, same thing, that the work has been performed where the contractor's saying. Basically, yeah, I agree with them, or where I don't agree with them. And if you remember, there was language in the B-101 that said, it's to the best of your knowledge, but it's not 100%, it's not a guarantee, you can't guarantee if the contractor has paid its subs or some of the other stuff. So the architect has some wiggle room in here, but this is the architect blessing the pay application. And in fact, as we continue 9.4.2, this sub 1, the architect has not made exhaustive or continuous on-site inspections. They haven't reviewed the means and methods. They haven't seen if the subcontractors are paid, or they haven't made an examination of where the contractors used previous money to pay the subs. This 1, 2, 3, and 4 under 942 is the exact same language as you found in your B101. Just like before. 9.5. Decisions to withhold certification. The architect can withhold certificate of payment in whole or in part if it's reasonable to protect the owner. So one time, let's say there's some times where this happens. Contractor submits an application for payment for $275,000. Architect walks the site, looks at the backup documentation, and yes, it appears that there's $275,000 worth of work. So we're all good. But then the architect finds out that a lien is going to be filed on the project by the electrical subcontractor. Or the architect knows that the project is going to be delayed such that there may be liquidated damages. Or the architect knows that some of the work, even though the $275,000 was properly invoiced, some of the work was defective, and you're going to have to rework it. In any one of those instances, the architect's entitled to withhold a portion of that pay application to protect the owner from defective work, from project delays, from liens and otherwise. And so that's what this is making sure that we're protecting the owner and not paying out. And there's later provisions that talk about it in more detail. And then we add provisions in our contract. We'll add to this section here and other sections more specifics about how much you can withhold and the timing. A lot of times it's 150% of the value of the defects and otherwise. But this is kind of the general that says you can withhold to the extent reasonably necessary to protect the owner. So, and then if they're unable to certify the pay application, they got to notify the owner and the contractor. And then they try to get a revised amount. This is why this part here, why you want to do the pencil draft, because this is kind of after the fact. Do your discussion before you submit the formal payment as opposed to after, because the after part here creates adversary and brings in lawyers and so forth, which is great for me, but not good for the project. And then when you can come to an agreement, then the architect shall issue a revised certificate for payment for whatever the value is to make that representation of the owner. And then here 9.5 is going to talk about, this is what I was saying, why they can withhold defective work that's not corrective, third-party claims filed, that could be a lien, failure of the contractor to pay subs, schedule, the reason the work can't be completed within the unpaid, this is price-wise, can't be done within the contract sum, damages to the owner, reasonable that won't be finished within the contract time, or just a general catch-all, repeated failure to carry out the work in accordance with the contract documents. So there's lots of reasons why the architect may say, yes, it looks like you have properly invoiced me for $275,000, but I'm only going to approve $200 because I have to protect my owner. That's what all these 1 through 7 are related for. Any questions on that? If there's a disagreement under 952 on either side between the owner and the contractor, they can turn to Article 15 to make a claim. 954, if the architect withholds certificate of payment under 95313, the owner may at its sole option issue joint checks to a contractor or a subcontractor. So I have had this come up in a number of instances. Here's an example. Contractor issues a $275,000 pay application. At the same time, the electrical sub files a lien for $100,000. Now, none of that $275,000 relates to electrical work. The lien was because the contractor hasn't paid its electrical sub for work that was done 2 months ago, or maybe 3 months ago, whatever it might be. An electrical sub's like, what do I have to do? I'm not in contract with the owner. I can't talk to the owner. So they file a mechanics lien on the project. It's actually an encumbrance on the title to the project. A mechanics lien takes priority over everything, over the bank's mortgage, over everything if they want to foreclose on that mechanics lien. So the owner now knows and is aware, because there's been this notice of a mechanics lien, that a subcontractor has raised its hand and says, I'm owed $100,000 for my work. And the owner's looking at this $275,000 pay application and says, well, there's no invoice for electrical in here. I'm going to go talk to the contractor. And he goes and talks to the contractor and says, why is the sub asking for $100,000? Oh, well, I didn't think I had some issues with their work and we're having problems with them on another project. You're like, I don't care about your other project. That's your other project. That's some other owner's problem. It's not my problem. Did they do the work here? Yes. Did they do the work right? Well, we have some issues with it. So you call your architect. Your architect goes out and checks it out and says, yeah, the work looks fine. You don't want to have a lien as the owner on your project, on your property. Because if you're using that property for, say, a bank loan or collateral or a whole host of things, and that lien sitting on top of that, it's an encumbrance. It also could mean there's litigation. At any given time, the subcontractor can sue you, and then you got to hire a lawyer and everything else. So what happens sometimes under 954 is the owner says to its architect, of the $275,000, you're only going to approve $175,000. And I am going to issue to the contractor $175,000, and then I'm going to issue a joint check to the contractor and the electrical subcontractor for the value of $100,000. Neither the contractor nor the subcontractor can cash it without the other person's joint signature, but at least the electrical subcontractor realizes that there's money sitting there that the contractor can't hold on to and keep, and it's for the subcontractor, it's made out to the subcontractor, but it's joint, and that they may not file a lien on your property, or they may remove the lien because there's money sitting there waiting for them when everybody kind of works through things. So that's what happens here, is sometimes you do that because there may be some personal dispute or squabble, or like the contractor said, we don't like their work on another project. Well, you don't care about the other project, you only care about yours. So there are reasons. It doesn't happen often. It doesn't happen often because when you do this, the contractor thinks you're usurping its positions with its own trades, but sometimes you have to do that to keep your title clear. And I've done this on a number of projects where there was, I had one project where there was all of a sudden we had some issues and everybody caught wind, and the next thing you know there was 25 liens filed against the property. And some were good liens and some were bad liens, and some we just wrote checks to the trades and we said to the GC, we're like, here's a joint check, clean it up. So sometimes it comes up. Yes, question. A good lien versus a bad lien, that's a great question. If you're a subcontractor, every lien's a good lien. A bad lien may be, it could be it's not timely filed is a bad lien. So because the liens have statute of limitations when they file. So that's a bad lien in the sense of bad for the subcontractor, good for the owner. A bad lien could be, again, bad for the subcontractor, good for the owner, where they overstate the value or the amount. So they say they're owed $130,000 and they're really owed only $100,000, and then there's questions of whether there's fraud or whether they're overstating. That's a potentially bad lien for the owner, or for the sub, good lien for the owner. A bad lien could be, though, on the owner's side where it's so murky that the dealing with trying to figure and sort through it sometimes isn't worth it to go through it. So there could be technical and legal reasons why it's bad, or it could be just how it impacts the project itself. Like why should there be a lien on your project when the contractor's not paying the sub if it's due to a dispute on another project? You know, you say to the contractor, this is a bad lien. I mean, they're owed this money, but why are they having to file it? If you have a problem on another project, you deal with that and that owner. Don't put it on mine. Don't cause them and your issues there to impact me. And so it's a valid lien, but it's bad for the project. Yeah. As opposed to if it's a statute of limitations issue or if it's improperly stated, that may be the question between a valid and invalid. A good or bad lien is there's never, as an owner, there's never a good lien. There's never a good time when they lien the project. But there may be ones that could be easier worked out that make sense. Others, like I said, if it's unrelated to your project, that's really a bad lien because it just costs everybody money. It doesn't make sense. So, progress payments. 9-6. So after the architect has issued certificate of payment and the owner makes the payment, as provided in the contract documents, whether it's, by a check or by escrow or what have you. And then under 962, the contractor shall pay each subcontractor no later than 7 days after receipt of payment from the owner. This is what's called a prompt payment clause. So when I give that $100,000 to the general contractor, they have 7 days, if it's not by joint check, they have 7 days to make payment to the sub. If they fail, if the contractor fails to pay within 7 days of receipt of its money, arguably the contractor's in breach. Because the contractor is promising to the owner, I'm going to do prompt payment because the subs need to eat, they need to pay their bills, I'm going to do prompt payment, and if the subs don't get paid promptly, they're going to file mechanics liens on the project. And then the contractor shall, by appropriate agreement with each subcontractor, require the sub to make payments to the sub-subs in a similar manner. Here is a flow-down provision where it actually says in black and white, you must slow this down. So there's provisions in Article 3 that says everything in this contract needs to go, the subs need to it. There's provisions in Article 5 that says contractors must abide by the provisions in this one. But here is a specific provision that specifically says you must flow this one down. And this is, again, one of the reasons this comes out of litigation and everything else, because sometimes what it used to have many, many years ago is it had where it said contractor must promptly pay its subcontractors or something to that effect. And then it didn't say anything about downstream. And so maybe the contractor would pay in 10 to 15 days to the sub, and then the sub-subs or the materialmen or the vendors or what have you, they're just waiting around for months and months as the money gets stretched out. So this is trying to make sure everybody gets paid quickly. 963, the architect will, on request, furnish to the subcontractor information regarding the percentage of completion amounts, blah, blah, blah. So here, what 963 says is, the subcontractor is going to submit its invoice to the general contractor. Most subcontractors work off of time and materials. The contractor's project may be submitted on a percent complete, so they may not match. The numbers may not match. No doubt, the subcontractor is not going to see the contractor's overall payment applications because it's got every trade. The electrician only cares about its money. They don't care about what's being paid to the concrete guy or the steel guy or whomever else. So, if there's problems or issues where the contractor's not paying the sub the amounts that the sub believes it's entitled to, in this case, maybe for my example, the $100,000, the sub can contact the architect and say, hey, can I see what percent complete we're at? Can I see what's really going on for my work? Because they're telling me you guys aren't paying me or whatever the contractor's saying. So here, 963 is just giving a heads up to the contractor. Not only do you have to pay under 962 within 7 days, but under 963, if you're stiffing your subcontractor to the value, we're going to have the ability to look under the curtain, under the hood, and give that information to the subcontractor. 964. The owner has the right to request written evidence from the contractor that they have properly paid their subcontractors. So, not only do we give the contractor notice that we're going to give some information to the sub, to keep you honest, we, if we want, can ask for information to show that you've actually paid your subcontractors. And that information has to be provided within 7 days. So it's, again, keeping everything moving in payment. This is so what happens here under 964, when you hear or you get this lien from the electrical subcontractor for the $100,000, you write a letter to the contractor and you say, pursuant to 964, what's the deal? I want to see proof that you've been paying them because they say they're owed $100,000. And I don't track that because I paid you for their work. Seems to be done properly. My architect says their work was good. Why are they saying you haven't paid them? Provide me proof. And within 7 days. Same with suppliers. 965 is suppliers as opposed to subcontractors, so if they have just direct materials. 966, the certificate for payment, a progress payment, or partial or entire use or occupancy of the project by the owner shall not constitute acceptance of the work that's not in accordance with the contract documents. So what does this mean? Basically what this says is, just because I paid you for the work doesn't mean I'm saying you did it properly. And in fact, a lot of times you may not know that there's a leaky roof or that the electrical was done improperly because it's behind a wall. The architect who's walking the site, maybe they're only once a week or once a month or only when needed and may not know. So if you remember the lawsuit that I told you about last week with the interstitial space and how they had changed the way the ceiling and everything was put together. In that case, the owner was the developer, but in another instance, if that was a different owner, there's so much that they wouldn't know with how the project was built because the architect was rarely on the project site. So this is basically saying, hey, I still can sue you if you did crappy work. Just because I paid you doesn't mean I can't get the money back. I just didn't see it, didn't know it. You're still obligated to perform good work. Um, 967 references what's called a payment bond. And we're not going to go and spend a lot of time. We talked a little bit about bonding on the insurance lecture. So I'm not going to get a great deal into that, but this is just basically a reference that you can have a bond on a project. As a real brief note, there are two types of bonds. One's called a payment bond. One's called a performance bond. The performance bond is between the owner and the contractor. And it basically says there's a bonding company, a surety, sitting out there. They're often part of an insurance company, but it's not really insurance. The bonding company is going to sit there and they're going to kind of be over the shoulder of the contractor. And that bonding company is guaranteeing to the owner that the performance of the work under a performance bond will be completed for the dollar figure that the owner agreed to. Contractor and owner enter into a contract to build a house for $1 million. There are 0 change orders to the project. Contractor goes bankrupt. The surety steps in and is going to perform the work, however, by bringing in their own contractors or what have you, and will complete the house for no more than $1 million. The owner only pays the $1 million. The surety may have to pay more, but it doesn't matter. That's what the performance bond is. That's between the owner and the contractor and the surety. A payment bond is between the contractor, the subcontractor, and the surety. Same scenario. Owner has a contract to build a house for $1 million. Contractor goes bankrupt. A bunch of subs are owed money for their work and want to finish the work. The surety steps in on the payment bond and pays those subs for the work they have performed to date and will continue to pay them out to complete the job. So that's the payment flows down, surety, contractor, sub, performance bond flows up. The contractor, owner, surety to make sure the money goes and the owner doesn't have to pay more than $1 million. That's all you kind of really need to know for purposes of the bond in this instance. 968. Provided that the owner has fulfilled its payment obligations, meaning as long as I paid you for your work done, the contractor shall defend and indemnify the owner from losses, liabilities, damage, blah, 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 reasonable attorney's fees, arising out of any lien claim or other claim or payment by a subcontractor. So, this is basically saying if you get an invoice, if you get a payment application, if the owner gets a payment application for the contractor, and we have this instance where the electrical subcontractor files a $100,000 lien, it's up to the contractor to step in and pick up that cost, whatever it is. To defend, indemnify, and hold, indemnify for this, defend and indemnify, meaning if there's litigation, if the subcontractor files to foreclose on the lien, it shouldn't cost the owner anything because the owner's already paid the contractor $100,000. So it's the predicate. As long as they fulfill their payment obligation, as long as I paid that $100,000 to the contractor for the electrical work, when the electrician files the $100,000 mechanics lien, the contractor has to step in the middle and take care of it, indemnify us, keep us from having to write the check twice. Does that make sense? Yes. Can the owner make claims against the subcontractors? Is that your question? So the answer to that is no. Because it depends. Well, if I write the contracts to allow them to be called what's called a third-party beneficiary, but in general it's no, because the owner has a contract, owner and the contractor, and all the subs that are underneath have their own separate contracts just for the contractor. So there's not what's called contractual privity. The only time that the owner will have and it won't even be a claim, but the owner will have this interaction legally with the subcontractor is if the sub files a mechanics lien foreclosure. Says, I'm owed that $100,000. And so what the owner may say is, but your work is defective, so they will use it as an affirmative defense. But all of the owner's claims for defective work, for delays, whatever the damages that the owner incurs, unless there's some specific end around language in an agreement, unless there's that, which is not standard, the owner's claims, if the owner has a loss, is only against the contractor. And then the contractor must look down to the subcontractors. So if there's an electrical problem on the project, the owner moves into the project, the lights don't work, there's a small fire, whatever it might be, it's all electrical. We know it's the electrician. We know the electrical company that performed the work. The owner sues the contractor. The owner does not sue the electrical company. Contractor then sues the electrical company. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. Yes. Plaintiff would be the owner. If the owner has a problem, sues the contractor will be the defendant. So what will happen is if there's let's say for my example, there's an electrical issue, the owner will bring a lawsuit against the contractor and be identified as plaintiff owner is suing defendant contractor for the electrical problems and all the allegations. The contractor will then file what's called a third-party claim. And the third-party claim will mimic all of the allegations against the contractor, but will now say contractor is suing subcontractor, and they will become a party to the case. So the contractor and the subcontractor will be in the litigation together. The subcontractor will be known as a third-party defendant. So they will be at the table, they'll be at the negotiations, the proofs will be all put out there. So, and that's sometimes some of the strategy that goes into is whether, I have had many situations where representing an architect, and the architect gets sued for design defects, but the architect didn't design it. Let's say, in this instance, it's an electrical design as opposed to electrical installation. A lot of times I will recommend to the architect, do not sue your electrical subconsultant. They're like, why not? They screwed up. First you say, well, how do you know they screwed up? Maybe they didn't screw up. Let's start there. And if there's a question, if you sue them, if the architect sues the electrical subconsultant, the only way the architect can win is to prove that their subconsultant was defective. But because your contract architect is with the owner, as soon as you prove that your subconsultant has defective design, you're responsible to the owner. You have effectively done the owner's job. So often what you'll do is in litigation, depending on statute of limitations, depending on the case and otherwise, sometimes you'll have a situation where you'll enter into, let's say, a joint defense agreement with that subconsultant. They work and cooperate together, but you don't sue them. And then maybe, if it turns out that the case is going to go sideways, and in fact the architect, the subconsultant, the electrical subconsultant, did screw up, and the architect's going to get, maybe then you bring a lawsuit. You have to look at statute of limitations, there's timing-wise. Sometimes you do bring them in. But there are very good reasons why not to. I think I've talked to you a little bit about the case where I represented the pump manufacturer out in the city of Monmouth. And we had a contract with the general contractor. The city sued the general contractor, and part of it was a defective pump. General contractor never sued us because the general contractor never thought that the pump was defective, and neither did we. So the city had to do an end around and sue us in fraud, and there was all these other issues on that. But we were never sued by the general contractor. We had a joint defense agreement with them, we cooperated with them, and we all used our own collective knowledge to gang up against the owner. So there are reasons why. But technically, back to your original question, if there's a problem, the owner can't sue the subcontractor, the owner sues the contractor third parties in the subcontractor, and everybody's at the dance together. Okay, 9.7, failure of payment. If the architect doesn't issue the certificate of payment through no fault of the contractor, so it's not a problem with what there is, within 7 days, and if the owner doesn't pay within 7 days, the amount that was certified, the contractor may, on an additional 7 days' notice to the owner, stop the work until payment has been done. And that makes a lot of sense. Look, if we're going to ask up in 9.6 that the contractor has prompt payment to its subs downstream, it's got to be fair that the architect has to review the pay application within 7 days, and the owner has to make payment within 7 days of that. I mean, that's just only fair. And if I'm not getting paid as a contractor, I'm going to stop my work. Because unless you can tell me that I shouldn't be paid, unless you're withholding for a valid reason, if it was good work, you haven't paid me, I'm not working for you. So that makes sense. 9.8, substantial completion. So as I said, substantial completion is where here they say that so that the owner can occupy or utilize the work for its intended use. So that's the definition in this agreement. The other one is, as I said, that I use all the time, it's fit for its intended use and purposes is another way of saying the same thing. 9.8.2. So as I said earlier, when the contractor considers the work or a portion thereof, because sometimes you have multiple substantial completion triggers, when they consider that it to be substantially complete, the contractor shall prepare and submit to the architect a comprehensive list of items to be completed or corrected prior to final payment. That's the punch list, 9.8.2. So what happens is, contractor says, your factory is complete, substantially complete, and here is the list of the only things that are left to do to get it to final completion. But that's where we think. We think we're done, except for this punch list. That's what's submitted under 9.8.2. 9.8.3 is once you get that list from the contractor, the punch list, the architect will make an inspection to determine whether the work is actually substantially complete. So it may not be the real punch list. It may be, well, you think this is all you think you need to get done, and you're not substantially complete, and add these to your list. Or you think these are just punch list items, but you say you're substantially complete with the house, but you haven't installed any of the appliances in the kitchen. That's not punch list. Well, they're coming. They're on order. We have to just bring them in and hook them up. No big deal. It's only going to take an afternoon. Yeah, but we can't use the house for its intended use and purposes without the kitchen appliances. It's not punch list. You're not substantially complete. So there's a give and take, a push-pull that happens between contractor and architect on substantial completion and what's on a punch list and what's not. The contractor shall, before issuance of the certificate of substantial completion, complete or correct such items that the architect has notified. So if, in fact, the kitchen appliances do show up and get installed, then they can reissue and ask for another inspection to see if they're substantially complete.
If you remember in the B-101 agreement under Article 6, I think it's Article 4, 4.3, it had how many times you're going to visit the site, how many times you review, it's a little like 4.3.1, how many times you review a shop drawing, how many times you're going to be on a project site. One of them is how many times you're going to inspect for substantial completion, and that's all built into 1 or 2 times, and then after that it's an additional services. So that's where this is triggering. And sometimes there's going to be more than one visit by the architect to see if in fact the project is substantially complete. (984) When the work or designated portion thereof is substantially complete, the architect shall prepare the certificate of substantial completion, and that shall establish the date. Now, why is that such a big deal? I mean, look, if I can go in and use the house and start cooking, or I can start making my toys, isn't that all I need? Why do I have to have this certificate? Why this formal process? 2 big reasons. Number 1, in the payment process, when you submit me an invoice, what's going to happen is there's this thing called retainage withheld, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But for every application for payment submitted by a contractor, the traditional figure is 10%. The owner's going to withhold 10% retainage. Contractor's already earned it, it's their money, but the owner holds on to that as kind of an incentive to make sure the contractor actually finishes the job. There have been many instances before this whole concept came into play where the project got to substantial completion, the punch list was prepared, and the owner took its money and skipped town and never came back because they were paid most of their work and they were like, I don't care. But if you withhold 10%, so you hold 10% of the $2 million project, there's a big chunk of money sitting out that the contractor is going to come back in and do the punch list work to get their $200,000. So, here, substantial completion is a date when retainage is released. Well, maybe not all of it, depending on how you negotiate it. A lot of times people release only half of it or a certain amount. But it's a big time. As the projects get larger and larger, 10% of a $300 million project is a huge chunk of money that the contractor wants released. So substantial completion is a big deal. I want my certificate to release my $3 million in retainage. That's a lot of money that's going to get released. That's the number 1. That's for the contractor, on the contractor side. The other reason why the certificate of substantial completion as a hard and fast date is important for the owner's benefit is that is when warranties start. Your 1-year warranty of workmanship, your 5-year warranty on doors and windows, your 20-year warranty on your roof, whatever that might be, the warranty clock starts ticking when the certificate of substantial completion is issued. So that's why they make the formal process a big deal, because it triggers money and repair obligations. Before substantial completion, anything that went wrong in the project and defect, the contractor's problem. After, it's a warranty issue, so they look at it differently. So. Questions on that? Right. 985. Upon acceptance and consent of the surety, if any, the owner shall make payment of the retainage, and here it is, applying the work or designated portion thereof. So this is specifically stating, hey, this is when retainage is going to get released. 9.9. Partial occupancy or use. The owner may occupy or use any completed portion or partially completed portion of the work, and such partial occupancy may commence whether or not the portion is substantially complete, provided the owner and the contractor have accepted in writing responsibilities relating to each of them for payments, retainage, otherwise. So, why would you go into a project before it was substantially complete? I mean, that doesn't make sense, but it may. So, if I'm developing a condo building and I'm selling condo units, I'm carrying a construction loan as the owner-developer. The construction loan is traditionally going to have a higher interest rate than a traditional loan. Or, if I can sell those units, my loan is reduced because I'm making money by selling the units. So I have a 10-story condo building that I'm building. First story is going to be the shop and the office. We talked a little bit about this, and it's going to have parking. And then it's going to be 9 stories of units. If I can sell and allow people in 3 blocks of 3 floors each, then I'm going to be able to get a return on my investments, whether it's condo or whether I'm renting it. I'm going to get money coming into me, and I can start to reduce my construction loan that's carrying a higher interest rate. So the overall building is not substantially complete, but I may have completed or created an interim trigger date of turning over substantial completion for certain portions. And so that's where you have partial occupancy or use. Or maybe you need to get into a factory. Maybe the factory portion is starting to work, but the office space isn't done. There are various reasons why you might want to get into a building before it's complete. Largely, it's economically driven. Maybe it's a family that needs to move because they have to get out of their rental unit, whatever it is, and they need to move into a house. So there's various reasons. But what you have to talk about here is they have to have the acceptance and responsibilities of each relating payments and otherwise and liabilities. So you have to come to an agreement. If I'm going to be in there early, you got to know it's an active construction site and so forth, and there may be separate discussions. But at least the agreement here recognizes that there can be partial occupancy. And then at the end here, the stage of progress of the work shall be determined by written agreement between the owner and the contractor, or if no agreement is reached, by decision of the architect. Somebody has to have some kind of trigger of when you're going to move in. So contractor comes and says, I've got the first 3 floors done. Have the architect inspect it. We'll have an interim substantial completion date. It's not final substantial completion date. Something to that effect. 993. Unless otherwise agreed on, partial occupancy of use or portion to portion of the work shall not constitute acceptance of the work, not complying with the contract document. Same thing, same like payment. Just because I paid you doesn't mean I think the work was done right. It just means I paid you. You still have the obligations to have done it correctly. Same thing here. Just because I moved in doesn't mean that you did it right. You still have your obligations to the contract to have performed your work correctly. 910. Now we're at final completion and final payment. So, what's going to happen upon receipt of the contractor's notice, the work is ready for inspection for final payment. The architect will go ahead and do that inspection. So, there's going to be a notice, I'm substantially complete by the contractor, architect does his job. Now here's a notice that I'm finally complete, architect does his job there. And they need to promptly issue a certificate of final payment, or final certificate of payment, to the best of their knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. The same language you saw for substantial completion. 910.2, neither final payment nor any remaining retained percentage shall become due until the contractor submits to the architect an affidavit of payroll. So this is the list. Sometimes they call this a closeout list or a final completion list. So they have to provide these things. And the contractor will not get paid. Even if the architect has said it's certified that it's complete, the owner doesn't need to make payment until the contractor gives the following. After the day that all payroll and everybody's been paid, evidence that the insurance will remain in force until final payment, written statement that the contractor knows of no reason that insurance will not be renewed, consent of the surety, if necessary, if there was a bond, that it's okay to make payment. Any special warranties, 5, or other data that the owner requires, receipts, releases, otherwise. So you create this final completion list, turning over of operators' manuals, all the warranties, all these documents, and they put it together in a book for you or binders and say, here's all the information. And upon receipt of that, then you release the last bits of retainage, whatever the final amounts that are owed, and everybody can go merrily on their way. If a subcontractor refuses to furnish or release a waiver required by the owner, the contractor may refurnish a bond satisfactory to indemnify the owner against such claims, security interest or otherwise. So here's an example where, let's go back to that subcontractor that had that $100,000 lien. Contractor's got everything else done, the owner's happy with everything else, but there's this dispute still with the subcontractor. And maybe the value of the project is what's sitting in the final payment, the final release. Maybe it's $1 million. The contractor's like, I want the $1 million. I got my owner's manuals, I got my warranties, the architect is good, you're good, you've already moved in, you're making your choice, whatever it is. I need my $1 million. So what can happen here is the contractor will say, I'm going to put up a bond, a separate bond that's going to cover this dispute with the subcontractor for the $100,000. It's going to be sitting over there on the side as security. Once I place that out there, owner, you will be insulated from claims or damages with the subcontractor. Now, please release my $1 million. So this is basically giving the contractor an ability to close out the project without being held hostage by the subcontractor. And you'd be surprised how often this comes up, where that dispute lingers long after the project's completed. And the contractor doesn't want to be frozen, so they want to use this to their benefit. And if it protects the owners, there's nothing wrong with it. Sometimes what I'll do here for this provision under 910.2 is, let's say there's a $100,000 lien, I'll require the bond to be $150,000 or $200,000, maybe 150% to 200% more than what's at dispute. That way it covers my legal fees or whatever else may come up. So you try to get more protection, but at the very least they need to put up 100% of the value at claim and loss. Okay. If after substantial completion, final completion thereof is materially delayed through no fault of the contractor, which affects the final completion, and the architect confirms that, the architect can make a certificate for the payment, and then the payment is due. So if there's something that happens that delays traditional final completion, whatever that may be, and it's not the contractor's fault, you can still work through this provision 910.3 to make sure that the money is released. (910.4) is interesting because it says once you've made payment, now the owner is waiving claims against the contractor. Remember, we've had these other ones, just because I paid you doesn't mean I'm waiving claims, or just because I moved in doesn't mean I'm waiving claims. Well, now here it says if I've made final payment, I'm waiving claims against the contractor, except any claims that arose out of the contract that are unsettled, so that $100,000 dispute, if it's unsettled, failure of the work to comply with the contract document, so in the future if the piece fails, you haven't waived that. Any warranty issues, you haven't waived that. And if there's an audit necessary and it turns out that the contractor's been spending more money than they should, or like the example of the question, either had too many people working on the project and an audit shows that it was overstaffed, so those are claims that are not waived. Even though I've paid you final, I can still preserve disputes against the contractor under sub 1, 2, 3, and 4 here. On the flip side, 910.5, once the contractor or subcontractor has been received final payment, their waiver of claims except those previously made in writing. So unless a contractor has something in writing, as soon as they take that last paycheck, every other claim that the contractor has been waived. They need to have identified in writing prior to acceptance, or it's waived. So a little different. Owner says, I get to hold these 4. Contractor can only hold on to those that they have specifically identified in writing. All right. Any questions on 9, payment? All right. Article 10, protection of persons and property. Safety programs, contractor responsible for maintaining and supervising the safety. So just we talked about that, different than the architect. Safety of persons and property. They need to prevent damages to the work, the employees, other property on the site, other properties adjacent to it. We're going to kind of flip through this as quickly because it's not not that safety isn't important, but we've talked about it in the B-101, and contractors are responsible for means and methods and so forth. They need to provide with all applicable laws under 10.2.2. They have to have a safe and existing project site. They have to keep hazardous materials and explosive off under 9.2.4 or 10.2.4. They need to promptly remedy damages or loss. And then depending on what's caused and who they are, indirectly or directly, and then they need to identify who's liable for those. So those are their obligations in addition to what they had generally to run a good, clean project site under 318 for indemnification. 10.2.6, they have to have a designated safety individual for this. Injury to persons or property under 10.2.8. If either party suffers injury or damage, notice of the injury needs to be made within 21 days, whether or not insured. So you have to give notice if there's something going wrong in a project, a 21-day notice. Hazardous materials, they need to comply with the laws regarding, and the contract documents regarding hazardous materials. And they need, if there's any precautions to make sure that there's no bodily injury or death resulting from these materials. So one thing on this, under 10.3.1 for hazardous materials, let's say you're on a project site. Sometimes I've been on project sites where they need to use ammonia for certain of their equipment, arc welding or what have you. If that ammonia, if there's something reason where there's ammonia is released, that could be a toxic cloud. And so we have to go through safety meetings before you come on the project site. Or if there's places where you need to have eye washes or all these things. So you need to do whatever is adequate precautions to make sure that there isn't going to be bodily injury. There's at every single construction meeting, there's going to be a safety tip, a safety talk. They're going to have somebody talk about some safety issue. You know, worker injury and safety is while I'm flipping through it in this contract, it is really critical and important for the contractors and how they run the business. And so you make sure that the contracts here require that they have that. If there is a safety condition that comes in, if they see something like in soils or hazardous materials, they must immediately stop work in the affected area and notify the owner, the architect, of the condition. So this would be like you're digging up soils. I had a project out in Navy Pier where they found thorium. And they had to shut down the project site in that area and identify the owner. Then we had to bring in the Illinois EPA and the EPA and go through whatever was necessary for abatement and so forth. But the contractor, this is one time where the contractor can stop that's unrelated to payment. Hazardous materials, I'm going to stop work, I'm not touching it. It was already there, if they didn't bring it on site. And then if there is this issue, if you get this notice, then it's up to the owner to bring out a licensed laboratory, and the contractor and the architect will reply to the owner in writing whether they have reasonable objections to the people doing the inspection. So when the project site, when the project itself has hazardous materials, it flips to the owners to clean up. Not the contractor bringing it in, but the project site in existence had hazardous, because it's the owner's site, it's the owner's dirt, so to speak, that has the hazardous in it. If there are issues, though, that are the owner here, if there are hazardous materials in the project site, in this case, the owner needs to indemnify the contractor and the subs for any losses. So if that soil has whatever material, PCP or other type of hazardous issues in it, and somebody gets injured from that, it's the owner that's indemnifying the contractor. The owner that's going to pick up those costs, not the contractor. That's in 10.3.3. 10.3.4. The owner should not be responsible under this section for hazardous material substances the contractor brings to the site. So this is the opposite. This is when the contractor brings it on site. The owner is not responsible for that. And then the contractor shall reimburse the owner for costs incurred for remediating in 10.3.5 for fixing the site where the contractor was the one that brought the hazardous materials on site. So it's a division. If it existed already, and if you kind of like think about it, if it's in the ground and it's there, it's the owner's dirt, it's the owner's responsibility. If it's brought there, it's the contractor's problem, the contractor's responsibility, and who has to carry the liabilities for that. Emergency, let's go through this. Okay. Insurance and bond. Now, we talked a lot about insurance, so I'm going to go through this section. I will just give you a brief overview right now before we go into the provisions. I am not a huge fan of the AIA's insurance language. It's a lot better. They now have an exhibit that goes with it. They've kind of changed some things up. I still do a lot of my own writers, but suffice to say that the contractor needs to carry its insurance for commercial general liability so people don't get hurt, automotive insurance. This is all that we talked about in the insurance lecture. And they'll probably have an umbrella, and then they'll have their employer's workers' comp and those types of things. And that's called for in this document. In the forms, like I said, there's a whole new exhibit that has this kind of big laundry list of all various different types of insurance that you can use. And that's an entirely different lecture that we won't go through. And then there's going to be, in that same exhibit, that separate exhibit, there's the insurance that the owners are going to carry. So basically it says, under 11, they got to pertain the insurance and the types of limits and conditions elsewhere in the contract documents, and described elsewhere is this other exhibit. And then they need to provide bonds if necessary under 11.1.2, and there's a whole other section about bonds and how big the bonds are and how they're going to function, and that's a separate AAA document as well. And then there's an obligation, if there's a cancellation of the insurance, you have to let people know when it's going to be canceled so you can keep the project insured. That's just a notice issue under 11.1.4. 11.2 talks about the owner's insurance, again, references to other areas in the contract documents, and that's the insurance exhibit. If there's under 11.2.2, if the owner doesn't carry property insurance, then the owner has its obligations. We won't get much into detail of this. Again, if the owner's property insurance is going to be canceled, they have to give notice to the contractor. Just so you guys know, as I'm going through this, obviously there's going to be no insurance questions on this exam for this, the B-101, or the A-201, because we had a different insurance. But I just want you to know that's why I'm blowing through this quickly. Waiver of subrogation, I will just do really briefly so you understand this concept. There's no questions on the exam of waiver of subrogation, but I want to take one beat here to explain it. So subrogation is a concept where, let me see how best to describe this. I have I got a crane and a crane operator that's out working, and they're lifting a bunch of steel for me. It's a high wind period of day. The day is really high wind. It's one of these giant cranes you see. And I got my crane operator, and he's moving steel from the laydown area to the area where the guys need it to do the installation. But they're dealing with high winds. And it turns out that due to a gust that comes in, it's safe. We think it's safe. It's not an issue, we believe, and it'll be part of the lawsuit will be whether you're operating safe or not. But a microburst comes in and knocks the crane over. And as a result of that, the crane is damaged and needs to be fixed, A. The operator in the crane that was in the cab with that, he gets injured. And then some of the steel hits and injures 2 or 3 other workers. So you got 2 sets of bodily injury, and then you got a physical property injury, the real property of the crane. Contractor goes to its insurance company because he has property insurance. He has insurance on the physical crane. And that insurance company pays the contractor, let's say it's $250,000 to fix the crane, pays the contractor $250,000 to fix that crane. So now the contractor has no loss. The contractor doesn't have any suit. Maybe it's not a microburst. Who knows what it is, but there's no loss to the contractor. If that insurance company steps in that paid that and wants to be part of some lawsuit, maybe they're saying it wasn't a microburst, it was the way the owner's other contractor had prepared the site, or who knows what happened, but there's another cause. Subrogation is where another insurance company steps into the place of the party that loses and litigates it on behalf of the individual. It's kind of like if you're ever in a car accident. If you're in a no-fault state, you get into a car accident, and you have $5,000 worth of damage to your car. Progressive comes out and writes you a check for $5,000, and then Progressive sues the other driver. That's called subrogation. You're the one that had the real loss because you lost in your car. But as soon as Progressive pays you, you're made whole, and Progressive subrogates in for you and sues the other driver. In construction, there's almost always a mutual waiver of subrogation. And the reason why is because there are many accidents and many issues that come up in construction cases, and who wants to be fighting against a multi-billion-dollar insurance company? The insurance companies can outlast you, outlawyer you, they can outspend you, whatever they want. And so you want to have a mutual waiver of subrogation on both sides. And that's what it talks about here. The owner and contractor waive all rights against each other, blah, 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 relating to insurance companies coming in. That's kind of what I want you to understand and take away from here. I have had cases where clients they want to have it only one way waiver of subrogation. it never goes well. This is something that I think in almost every construction contract I've ever negotiated, good one, is it's a mutual waiver. Both sides say, if I got a claim, I'm going to battle you one-on-one. We're not going to let the carriers come in. I may get paid by the carrier, but they're not going to come in and stand on my feet. So that's that. Let me see. Loss of use bid interruption. 11.4 just talks about a different type. So the owner may purchase insurance dealing with loss of use. So let's say I wanted to get that toy factory up and running. I may, or loss of business interruption. If I can't get it up and running, I can buy separate insurance that relates to paying for the losses I have for not getting my toys being made on time. That's another thing that can come into projects. And that's it on insurance. Did you have a question? I can go back. Did you have a question or no? Okay. So that's just basically what you need to know on this AA document is insurance is recognized as a whole separate agreement. I will say this, it's much, much better. The new insurance rider that the AA put together is much, much better, and I have used it for projects as opposed to the past. This Article 11 used to be like 25 paragraphs. It was so long, and I would just strike the whole thing and put in my own rider. But now they're new riders. It's better. It's not the best, but it's still better. So, Article 12, uncovering and corrections of work. So sometimes it says a portion under 12.1.1. Portion of the work is covered that's contrary to the architect's requests. It must request in writing by the architect to be uncovered, the architect examination, without charging the contractor or changing the contract time. So sometimes the architect's going to come by and they're going to say, well, you put the drywall up before I was able to see if the electrical and plumbing lines were properly installed. I can't tell if you did your job right. That's part of my job for the owner is to inspect, and you were not supposed to button up this wall before I had the inspection. Tear down the drywall. I want to look at everything, and then put it back up, and it's not going to be an extension of time or cost. At least that's what 12.1.1 says. 12.1.2 says if the portion of the work that has been covered that the architect is not specifically requested to, because 12.1.1 says it's if you already wanted to inspect it. You thought you were going to have a chance and you didn't. 12.1.2 says if it was not requested to be examined, it is covered, and the architect can ask that work to be uncovered. If it's done properly, then the cost shall not be at the contractor's expense. So, if the architect and the schedule says they get an opportunity to inspect where the plumbing and the electrical conduit is going to be, and the contractor's covered up before the architect had the opportunity, and everybody knew the architect wanted to see that, the contractor has to rip the drywall out to let the inspection happen, and then at the contractor's time. But if the contractor didn't know, it wasn't on the schedule, it was something that the architect just wanted to look at, the architect can tell the contractor to pull the drywall off and do the inspection. If the work was done properly, the owner has to pay for that additional drywall and time to make it done right. If the work was done improperly, it's the contractor's time. That's what these provisions say. Correction of the work, 12. Any questions on that? That makes sense? Correction of the work, 12.2. And this is another reason why substantial completion is important. If it's before substantial completion, if work is determined to be defective before substantial completion, the contractor promptly corrects the work that's rejected by the architect, and the cost for correcting the work shall be at the contractor's expense. So I'm the architect, I'm walking around the project site, I see something done, it's not done right, it's before substantial completion, I tell the contractor, that's defective, fix it, you take care of it. Your work, you installed your cabinetry, it's crooked. The floors are cupping, you need to fix that floor. This is in the wrong location. Whatever is considered defective, if it's before substantial completion, the contractor needs to take care of it promptly. Doesn't get schedule extension, just needs to do it and get it done. That's before substantial completion. After substantial completion, if you remember, that's when the warranties trigger. And with a warranty issue, it's the owner that gives notice during, in this case, the traditional is the 1-year period. And if the owner fails to notify the contractor or give the contractor an opportunity to make corrections, the owner waives the right to correct the work because they've breached their warranty. So what happens is after substantial completion, now it's not the architect because the architect's not on the project site. The owner sees something wrong and they're going to call up the contractor and they're going to say, the air conditioner's not working. The air conditioner's under warranty. Send somebody out, fix it. And the contractor has to send somebody out and fix it, and there's no cost to the owner. But if the owner lets it go, and there's a problem, and it keeps grinding on itself, and they don't call the contractor in time, and it gets worse and worse, and then you finally call you up at like month 11, or maybe it's even month 13, that's the warranty. You say, well, the air conditioner's not working. It hasn't been working for 6 months. Well, if the contractor comes out and it's defective and it's gone worse, the contractor can say, well, you breached your warranty, owner. You didn't let me know in time. It's been grinding on itself. If you called me 6 months ago, I could have fixed it, but now it's damaged beyond repair. So you breached the warranty. So there's some rules that the owner now, after substantial completion and the warranties kick in, the owner has certain obligations. Before substantial completion, no matter when it's defective and seen, contractor has to fix it. After substantial completion, the owner has to kind of be on top of the game a little bit. Still gets it fixed for free, at least for a year, but they have to make sure they give everybody, the contractor, the opportunity to do its job. Question?
So if your conditioner wasn't working some part of the house, why would you call the contractor for the rest of the company?
Good question. So the question is, if your air conditioning is defective, why would you call the contractor instead of the air conditioning manufacturer or the air conditioner installer? Depends on how the closeout of the project went. So some projects, you ask for and you get all the warranties in your name and they're transferred to you, and therefore you can have that direct discussion or relationship with the subcontractor or the trade or whoever did the installation. And that's normally the best situation, but not always. Sometimes the ability to get that individual entity to respond may be difficult, and you don't have, well, you may have the warranty documentation, whether you have the agreement or the ability to leverage, and sometimes the contractor has a better leverage point. I did, many years ago, I worked on a project, actually it was a purchase of a project. It was a Trump building that my client purchased. And they purchased it as is, but there was tons of stuff that was done wrong with the project. And so as we went out and inspected everything, we tried to get a bunch of the trades to come back because it was as is, but we had a bunch of warranties in hand. The trades wouldn't come out. Now, what we learned, and this was going back, this is probably 15, 18 years ago, what I learned out there was, had Trump, because of his command of the real estate market and everything else, had Trump still owned the building, whether the warranties actually expired or not, those guys came back. They often came back because he would give more work. And I don't know which one of his bankruptcies before or after this was, but and that happens with many contractors, is the contractor has the relationship, so you would go to them because it's better to go to them. Or another situation would be is, let's say you have a 5-year warranty on that air conditioner instead of a 1 year, and the air conditioner fails in year 3. And it turns out the installer, the entity that installed it, not the manufacturer, but the installer, because it's an installation defect as opposed to a manufacturing defect, maybe they're out of business. So if you still have your warranty with your contractor, you call the contractor, and you don't care who they bring out to fix the installation, the contractor's still on the hook. So it all depends on how the warranties are written and how you kind of cut the deal at the end. But sometimes you would go directly to the manufacturer.
So if you have the warranty in your name and the company should go out of business and install, could you still, with the contractor ready, like, do your life?
Yeah, I would call the contractor right away. Now, the contractor would come back and say, hey, your contract requires that the warranties be written in your name. And so as soon as it turned it over, my warranty obligation's gone because carrier had a warranty written in your name. It's got your name on it. And I would say, fine, but your contract still says you have a warranty for me. So it's a push-pull. Yeah, this piece of paper is in my name, that's right, but it didn't take your name off this contract. So that's how you would argue that. Yeah. I mean, because think about it. It's not you as the owner paid for the warranty. And built into every construction bid is the contractor's cost for insurance, for its warranties, for, all these other stuff. It's built into its pricing. That's in its overhead and profit. And you won't ever see it broken out that way. But if you paid for a 5-year warranty, and the contractor hired a subcontractor that went out of business, why should you be the one on the risk for that? They hired, and maybe the contractor shouldn't be on the risk for that either, but somebody has to, and you paid for it. And the contractor, maybe they entered into a contract with a crappy sub. Who knows? So, yes, you have this piece of paper, but it's now effectively worthless, so you go back to the contractor. You try to do that. And there's going to be arguments of why you don't get that recovery, and it depends on what the language of the agreement said. So, the 1-year 12.222, the 1-year portion for the correctional work shall be extended with respect to the portions of the work first performed after substantial completion by the period of time between substantial completion and the actual completion for that portion of the work. So remember, substantial completion is the trigger date for when all the warranties kick in. But let's say substantial completion happens in February, and you don't turn that air conditioner on until July. Should you lose 6 months of that warranty? Or let's say that substantial completion finished in February, but the landscaping couldn't happen until May, and the swing set for the kids' park couldn't happen until June. That work occurred after substantial completion, so the warranty for that work post-substantial completion and that 1 year or whatever it is starts when that work is completed. It creates its own little trigger date because of 12.222. So, skipping down 12.2.4, the contractor shall bear the cost of correcting destroyed or damaged construction of the owners or separate contractors, whether completed or partially completed, caused by the contractor's correction or removal of work that is not in accordance with the contract document. So sometimes the contractor comes in, and this will happen. I've had lots of discussions in contract negotiations. Let's say that the contractor is building a factory, and part of the factory has specialty equipment that needs to be installed that the contractor and its suppliers put into the factory. Owner doesn't have anybody separate for that piece of work. Owner brings a separate contractor in for, let's say it's a manufacturing plant, and the owner brings in a separate contractor to make equipment that packages. So you got the equipment that, like for example, our toys. Contractor does the factory, creates the production lines that makes the toys. Owner brings a specialty separate contractor that packages, boxes it up. Okay. The toy line is surrounded by the packaging line. And the only way to get to fix the toy line is to remove portions of the packaging equipment. You have to physically move the packaging equipment out of the way. Contractor didn't perform any of that work because the only way to do its warranty work on its own manufacturing equipment is to get inside the guts. What this says is if there are problems that the contractor causes to the packaging equipment, the extra stuff, but what is performing its warranty work, the contractor pays for that. In order to get to its equipment, they have to remove or damage things. If that happens, contractor's on the hook for that. And this does happen a lot in manufacturing and those types of facilities where equipment's on top of equipment and you have to get to your own stuff. So this is an important provision for that. 12.2.5, nothing contained in 12.2 shall be construed to establish a period of limitations with respect to the obligations, blah, blah, blah. Establishment of the 1-year period for correction as described in 12.2.2 relates only to the specific obligation of the contractor to correct the work and has no relationship to the time within the obligation to comply with the contract documents. So, what this basically says is we have a warranty, 1 year, 2 year, 5 year, and if your work is defective during those periods of time, we're going to come in and fix it under a warranty. If I got a 1-year warranty, but the statute of limitations in the state of Illinois is 4 years, just because I had a 1-year warranty doesn't mean I'm not on the hook for defective work for 4 years. I still have to be on the hook. A warranty does not supersede or change your traditional statute of limitations. Okay? So what happens is how does this play out? Owner has a defective air conditioner, calls the contractor in month 6. My air conditioner is not working. Because it's warranty, the owner doesn't have to prove anything, why it's not working or not. The contractor under the warranty has to come in and fix it, and repair it or replace it. That's in month 6. It's a 1-year warranty. The 1 year expires, and in year 2, the owner says, my air conditioner is not working. First time. They didn't make the 6-month one. They just call up for 2 years. My air conditioner is not working. Contractor's like, well, it's out of warranty. Yeah, but you have a contract that you're supposed to provide me an air conditioner that works. Well, now what happens is I still can make a claim against the contractor, but I have to prove that the reason why it's not working is because of defective construction. So warranty, owner has no burden of proof. After the warranty's expired, but within that statute of limitations, now you have to prove the reason why it's defective is the contractor's fault, and then they have to pay for it. So that's the reason why it's important that this issue is in here, that there is a distinction between warranty and just your regular claims. Article 13, anything more on warranties and uncovered conditions. Okay. Article 13, miscellaneous provisions. Yes, question. Yeah. Oh, good question. So the question is if there's a defect during construction or even after, the owner normally would look to the architect to find out if there's a defect. But now we're after construction, now we're a year or 2 years or whatever out. Does the owner have to talk to the architect about that defect, like the initial decision maker and everything else? Are they ones that's supposed to come in? Is that what your question is? Yeah.
When this project is done, so maybe within the period of warranty, the building is meant to operate in areas of in full condition without any defect. When there's a problem that we might not give the leakage or something, does the owner make the contractor or the architect complain about that?
So, again, the question is whenever there's a defect, when is it that the owner communicates directly with the contractor or when is it the architect? So, think of it this way. During construction, the architect is going to walk the site because that's their job under their contract and they're kind of your watchdog. That doesn't mean that the owner doesn't have to walk the site too, is precluded from walking the site. The owner can walk the site, and if the owner sees something wrong, the owner can identify that. In the new 2017s, they can communicate directly with the contractor. Previously, they had to go through the architect in the old versions, but in the 2017s, they can communicate directly with the contractor. If they do, if the owner does communicate directly with the contractor, they need to loop the architect in under their discussion. The same thing post-construction. But in post-construction, more likely than not, it's the owner that's going to see it because they're living in the building and occupying it. And the architect is only going to be brought in if the owner says, well, is this right or wrong? In neither instance is the owner precluded from communicating its dissatisfaction or the identification of a defect directly to the contractor. If it's during construction, you must loop the architect in. If it's post-construction, you can talk directly to the contractor. But if you think it's a construction defect, it's always a good idea to bring the architect in to support because they were the ones walking the project site. I have a case right now where the owner, there's both construction and design defects, but even in that instance, for the construction defects, normally I would bring the architect in and say, what do you think? Was this wrong and everything else? But here, we believe that the architect did such a poor job in its observation during the construction administration that not only did the contractor do it poorly, but the architect didn't catch it and should have, because it was so open and obvious. So in this instance, we're not talking to the contractor or the architect. I got a new architect, I got a new contractor, we got everything fixed, and then we're going to go after them. So, but that's not always the situation. So there's no reason why there's no reason saying that the owner can't talk to the contractor, and there's no reason that says the owner can't talk to the architect. In fact, you want to communicate as much as you can. It just depends on how the notice is. If it's before construction and you go directly owner-contractor, you must loop the architect. If it's after, there's no rules. So, okay? Okay, 13.1 just says parties have selected whether it's going to be arbitration or some binding dispute resolution. 13.2 talks about successors are assigned to whoever's after the project. 13.3 talks about whether there's going to be financing or lending for the project. We don't have to worry about that. 13.3.2 under rights and remedies. This is an important one. Just kind of generally think about. No actions or failure to act by the owner, the architect, or the contractor shall constitute a waiver of a right or duty afforded under that contract. So that kind of is going to your issue. If I don't bring something up, if I fail to raise it as an owner, if I fail to raise it as an architect, just because I failed to raise it doesn't mean I've waived that ability to make that claim. So if I'm walking a project site and I see a defect but I don't raise it, but it's still defective, I can still bring it up later. Should I have brought it up? Is there some burden on me to carry some of it? Certainly the architect would need to, but the owner may or may not. So it's not a waiver by failure to bring something up. 13.4 just talks about various tests and inspections that happen and how that process works. Under 13.4.2, there could be reasons for having additional testing that both the owner, the architect, or maybe public authority requires. And those costs, if it's additional, if it's more than what's traditional standard, the owner needs to pick that up. The testing requirements, if they're going to happen under 13.4.3, happens in accordance with the contract documents. And if those need to be done, if there's a failure of some of the work, so if there's a problem and you need to test because there's a failure, then it's the contractor's expense. So if they reveal a failure, then the contractor has to pay for those tests. Talks about observations, allows everybody who gets to be able to see the test, the owner and the architect. Payments. And then moving on to Article 14, termination or suspension. So real quickly here, the owner may terminate the contract if it's stopped for the contractor can terminate if the project has been stopped for more than 30 days by no fault of the contractor. So that's one reason to terminate the project. I strike this always. I say a contractor can terminate for only one reason only, failure to be paid. Other than that, the contractor has to sit there. They can, if there's a suspension of the project, if there's a delay, they can charge you for their costs incurred during the delay. That's something that you hate to have a contractor walk out if the project is stopped for 30 days. The owner's then completely screwed. So I always strike that. And I don't get much pushback from contractors on this. So here, the payment, failure of payment is whether it's an act of government or the architect hasn't given you the certificate of payment, or there's some kind of court order. Even if those happen, the contractor can still recover their suspension costs. Contractor may terminate if there's been suspension, delays, interruptions for more than 120 days and 365-day period. So it doesn't have to be 30 straight days. It could be a bunch of days over a year period that they can terminate for that. If under 14.1.1 or 14.1.2 exists, the contractor can give 7 days notice, and that gives the owner a chance to kind of fix and recover for that. And the contractor can get its costs, including reasonable overhead and profit, for work not executed. This is a killer. If the contractor says, I'm terminating this project, and I haven't, let's say that it's a $4 million project and they're only $2 million in, if they can get overhead and profit on work not executed, they're going to get their fee on $2 million worth of work they never did. So this is something that almost always is stricken, this lost profit claim. And contractors generally won't push back on that if they lose for work not performed. Profit for work they perform, they need to be paid. But if they didn't perform the work, they shouldn't get that lost profit. That's a windfall. So, if the work is stopped for a period of 60 consecutive days to no act or fault of the subcontractor, the contractor may, upon its 7 additional days, terminate the contractor and recover for owner as provided in 14.1.3. So there's another reason for termination. And then the owner, under 14.2, the owner can terminate for cause, and they can terminate for these 4 reasons. If they fail to supply enough skilled workers or materials, so that was your question way back when, what's considered adequate or sufficient material or people, fails to make payment. If they don't pay their subs, that's a breach, they can be terminated. If they disregard the laws, that's a breach, can be terminated. And then this big giant catch-all. Otherwise is guilty of substantial breach of a portion of the contract document. So anything else, if it's substantially breaching that, the owner can terminate for cause. And if they're going to go in, the owner will have this initial decision maker, which is going to be the architect. They're going to come and take a look at that, to do that, to make sure that the termination was proper. I had a big lawsuit on this one provision itself. Basically what happens under 14.2.2 is the owner's like, I think one of those 4 items in 14.2.1 has occurred. Whether it's they didn't have enough workers or they didn't pay their subs. In this instance, they didn't have enough workers and couldn't get the work done timely. And the owner brought in an engineer to certify. Under 14.2.2, 14.2.2 requires them to certify. They brought in an engineer to certify, and the engineer didn't do its due diligence. It didn't investigate all the items that were necessary to say that the termination was proper. And so the owner terminated us for cause, and we were able to prove that they didn't do their work to show that we actually couldn't have finished the project. And we ended up winning a lawsuit. It was about a $2 million benefit to my client because of our lost claims that we had as a result of that. So this is important. But what happens is after they do the inspection, they have to give 7 days written notice to terminate the employee of the contractor. And then they can keep the contractor off site. They can take subcontracts onto their own. They can bring the electrical or the mechanical or whatever subcontracts underneath them. And then the owner can finish the work on their own. So that's what happens there. 14.2.4 is how you do the calculation of costs. So basically what happens is, if there's a termination for cause, and we have the $4 million project, the owner comes in and it's $2 million into it. This is based on your expectation damages calculation. The owner comes in, terminates the contractor, brings a new contractor in, and it costs $3 million to finish it. But it was only going to be $2 million if they paid the other contractor. The owner in that case is entitled to $1 million in damages from the contractor. Because it was a $4 million project, had paid the first contractor $2, had to pay $3 more, so that's $5. So the owner paid an extra $1 million. That's a recovery that the owner can get under 424 for the additional costs. On the other hand, it's a $4 million project. You terminate contractor 1 after $2 million, and it only costs $1.7 to finish. The $300,000, that's going to be paid to the contractor because the contractor should have been able to finish it on time and on budget, so that the clause was not proper. So that's what happens under 422. Just talks about how the payment is allocated. We did that in damages, so that was in the first part of the semester. Yes. Yes. Though the contractor's never going to get it back, but they should. So, suspension in time, so the owner can suspend the contract the same way. Without cause, contractor in writing can suspend. So they can suspend it whenever they want. So its suspension is for no reason, whatever reason. If that is, though, if there's a suspension at the owner's whim, the contract time under 14.3.2 and some need to be increased caused by the suspension. So if you're telling the contractor stop, and that may happen on financing or whatever may happen, the owner's on the hook for those costs. They don't have to pay under sub 1 if the suspension was because the contractor was responsible. They don't have to pay if there's an equitable adjustment that was being denied under another provision. If there's another reason why the suspension happened, you don't have to give an equitable adjustment. And then last, I think, termination for convenience. Again, so contractor can terminate for cause. Contractor never can terminate for convenience. Even though I say they only can terminate for no payment. There's some other ones in this one. Terminate, the owner can suspend or terminate for convenience whenever they want. They can just say, I don't like you anymore. Now, most owners won't do that because it's very cost prohibitive to terminate a contractor. But here, they can do it at any time, terminate for convenience, and without cost, whenever they want. And they have to give reasonable notice, and the contractor has to cease operations under 4221. They have to take actions necessary to direct the protection and preservation of the work, and they need to terminate all existing subcontracts and enter into no further subcontracts. Now, the one difference here, really quickly, is that under termination for cause, the owner can take assignment of the subcontractors. They can say, I like your electrician, I like your plumber, I like your carpenter. When I'm terminating you for cause, I want to keep them. If I'm terminating for convenience, the owner does not have that right. The contractor can say, you get nobody. Go find your own people. Go find your own toys, your own sandbox. You figure out how to finish this project. If you're just terminating me because you don't like me or because for whatever reason, I don't want to give you any of the benefit of my hard work, including negotiating myself. So that's one big difference between cause and convenience of how it impacts the owner. And then the cost, what happens there is if it's terminated for convenience, the owner has no damages because the owner just said, I don't want you anymore. So the damages in that instance is the contractors. And for the contractor, it's work they've already performed, costs for what they have to terminate. If they have to get rid of their own subs, they got to pay them. And then potentially a termination fee or profit. So the contractor, when it's termination for convenience, that's why you don't want to do it. It's very expensive for an owner to terminate a contractor for convenience. It happens, but very rarely. And what I'm going to do is I'm not going to go into claims and disputes today. So what I'm going to do is we have our last session, because I want to get you guys out of here, our very last session is kind of a wide open review. So I'm going to go over Article 15 there instead of keeping, and I can keep you guys for another 15 minutes, but I don't want to do, unless you want to stick around. It's up to you guys. Because we have time in the last session. The last session was going to be just doing a review of the claim, and I can just go over this then if you want to do that. Okay, we'll do that. Yeah. Or maybe even the next one. I think the next one's pretty quick either, but we'll just stop here and we'll finish this up. Because I think it is important to understand how claims and disputes happen in this, and obviously I took a little bit longer. I apologize. Normally I get this done, but I don't want to start a new one if we don't have to. All right? Thanks, guys.